Okay, sounds like, actually, okay. All right. Well, first I wanted to start by welcoming you all here today. And for those of you on the webcast, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. This is just one of the first forums the Commission has held with respect to the future, the technology, and to hear from experts throughout the state that are planning for our future in California. And I guess before we get started, I wanted to introduce the commissioners that are here today in the room. Actually, we're missing three commissioners that will be here shortly. But we have Commissioner Chris Kehoe and Commissioner Fran Inman. Would you stand? And okay. We also will be joined today by Commissioner Madaffer and Commissioner Gardino and Commissioner Gilmetti. So they should be arriving here shortly. We also have, I also just want to let everyone know that this is a very important forum for the Commission. The Commission has a role not only in programming and allocating transportation funds, but also plays a key role in assisting the legislature with respect to transportation policy issues and providing advice to the legislature. And so with that in mind, I also want to let you know that we have commissioners throughout the state that are also viewing the webcast to hear from the panelists. I can't tell you the level of interest that we have within the Commission with respect to hearing from the experts today. So I also wanted to just, again, thank you all. Thank you to the legislative staff that are here today that are viewing, and all the stakeholders that have an interest in this forum today. So throughout the day, as we hear from panelists, oh, sure. Yeah, it's actually, we don't have that many here. Would we like to hear from who's in the room today? We have a microphone.
Yeah, hi, Andrew Zingali with Assemblymember Kevin Mullins' office.
Joshua Cunningham, California Air Resources Board.
Bernard Soriano. I'm Deputy Director at the California Department of Motor Vehicles and in charge of the autonomous vehicles regulations.
Lance Christensen, Senator John Morlock's Chief of Staff.
Hi, good morning. Cynthia Alvarez with Assemblymember Nazarian's office.
Christine Casey with the California Council on Science and Technology.
Annie Chow from Mr. Bloom's office.
Nardo Skirma, also from Assemblymember Bloom's office.
Marco Anderson, Southern California Association of Governments.
Jeff Shoemaker with Lindsay Transportation Solutions. We supply the road zipper removable barrier.
Mitch Weiss with the California Transportation Commission.
Erica Martinez with Earth Justice.
Michael Ford, City of Oakland Department of Transportation.
Molly D'Agostino, UC Davis Institute of Transportation Studies.
Daniel Maloney with Democratic Caucus.
Taylor Glass with Senator Scott Wiener's office.
Ellen Greenberg, Deputy Director for Sustainability at Caltrans.
Nick Zangiani, Director of Consumer Protection and Enforcement at the Public Utilities Commission.
Tony Siba with Rethink X. I'm going to be a speaker.
I'm Jared Sanchez with the California Bicycle Coalition.
Jana Dawson with the Assembly Transportation Committee.
I'm Melissa White, also Assembly Transportation Committee.
Aaron Riches, Senate Transportation and Housing Committee.
Eric Salo, Southern California Edison.
Larry Rillera with the California Energy Commission.
Kelly Kerber with the California Air Resources Board.
Jim Appleton, Caltrans Division of Research, Innovation, and System Information.
Heather Adamson, Association of Monterey Bay Area Governments.
Jay Tinker with the California Department of Transportation.
Gino Endo, Transportation Programming, CTC Liaison.
Laura Pennybaker, California Transportation Commission staff.
All right. Commissioners, that was an excellent idea, and unfortunately we can't hear from those on the webcast watching, but just hearing all of you, where each of you is from, who you're representing, and your positions, it's just that much more solidifying the importance of a forum like this, where we can all come together to hear from experts, and then we can take what we learned today and work together on planning for the future and moving forward as we look to the future on the necessary infrastructure and other improvements that we need to make collectively. So I wanted to start out just by some of the housekeeping. The restrooms are outside, the women's room to the left and the men's to the right. If there's an emergency, there's an exit, just follow the exit signs right out the door. And as far as the webcast viewers today, we do want to take questions and answers. And for those of you viewing the webcast, there's a email link. It's right there, and just send your questions to that email, and we will get to your questions to the extent as possible that time allows. So just as a way of introduction, as we all know, California is a huge state, close to 40 million in population, with almost 34 million in registered vehicles. And last year alone, 2.1 million new vehicles were sold in our state. We know that there are news articles, we read those every day about the dramatic changes to how people and goods will be transported in the future. It's amazing all the technical developments that are underway. I'd like to stop real quick. Here's Commissioner Guardino, just joined us. So, all right. And so autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, drones, truck platooning, Hyperloop, we're being bombarded with new innovations in transportation, which is a wonderful thing. But is California positioned to handle these changes? And the question that we were hoping to hear from the panelists is there certain legislation that's necessary to address the statutory impediments to bringing forward the technological improvements that are underway now? We all agree that major changes in transportation are in the works, and we need to talk about what the state policies are that are needed to be developed or amended to allow for these changes to take place. And also to address the potential negative impacts that the state needs to prepare for. So during today's forum, we will discuss these issues. I do want to let everyone know that we won't be touching today on the licensing of either autonomous vehicles or drivers. The purpose of today's forum is to look beyond those regulatory types of issues and focus more on a broader viewpoint of how these technological changes will impact transportation overall, and what are the possible actions we should undertake in California to address these changes. One of the most important actions the states can do to support technological changes to transportation is to adequately maintain our existing transportation infrastructure. California is now on the right track to fix it first through Senate Bill 1, the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017. This is a major step forward to assisting us in maintaining and rehabilitating our existing infrastructure. This $5.4 billion in annual funding for both the state highway system and local streets and roads is a significant boost to ensure California is preparing to move forward to address future transportation needs. And the California Transportation Commission is responsible for programming and allocating a majority of the funds that are authorized under Senate Bill 1. I mentioned earlier the Commission has a key role in advising the Transportation Agency Secretary and the Legislature on policy matters. So this forum is very timely, since the Commission is in the process of developing guidelines to implement the Senate Bill 1 programs that were authorized. And this bill, this act, calls upon Caltrans and cities and counties to use advanced technologies in their projects to the extent possible and cost-effective. So we are very fortunate today to have a wide range of experts to talk about possible policy considerations in the area of transportation technology. And I just want to state that this is our first, I mentioned earlier, our first forum of this nature. And we know today we're not going to be able to address all the issues. And so we'll watch today, see how this forum works, and if it's valuable, we'll look at holding additional forums like this in the future. So before I turn it over to the first panels, I'd like to really just ask the commissioners if they have anything they'd like to share. Commissioner Inman, do you want to come up?
Well, I just want to add thank you to all of you for taking your time to join us today. It's great to have so many of our sister agencies here with us and our partners with the legislature, those of you that help us make sure that our policies are where they should be. I hope y'all did your homework. There were a lot of reading materials attached to the back of our agenda, and clearly, as Susan said, we can't get through all of that today. But it really, I think, not only is the world changing as we speak, but it's changing at lightning speed. So for all of us wearing whatever hat we wear in terms of this mobility world that we're in, I think it really, really is important for us. So thank you, Susan, and our staff for making this happen, and my fellow commissioners for taking the time to really see what we can all do collectively together, because there's so many different pieces to this puzzle. So I did my part. I was multimodal this morning. I've been 3 different modes of transportation, 4 if you count my walk at various segments. So I think for all of us it's important to really be at the table and figure out what our future looks like.
Commissioner Kehoe?
Good morning. I just want to add to Commissioner Inman's remarks and say, first of all, thank you to the Commission for putting together this important technology forum and for inviting the panelists. The documents that came with the agenda were fascinating and broad, from heavy-duty, at least to me, data analysis to more big picture trend descriptions. My personal interest in being here today is, and I hope the panelists will get a chance to address this as we go, California, of course, is a leader in legislation around innovation, from clean air and pollution and energy efficiency to many, many other issues. And so I think many jurisdictions all over the world look to California for leadership on the policy side. So those kinds of suggestions are always valuable. For me, I would like to know what consumers are going to see, and I know that's not exactly legislative direction, but legislators hear from their constituents. So what Californians are going to see in their neighborhoods for around autonomy or how they can interact with that will be important, and also all the climate change issues, whether the oil industry will truly be disrupted, whether we'll all give up our driver's licenses and personal vehicles. I'd like to hear those kinds of issues addressed. So thank you, Susan, for putting all this together.
And before we turn it to the panel, I just want to introduce Commissioner Gometti. He's here in the room. So thank you for joining us, Curtis. And I introduced you already, Garth. I'm waiting for Commissioner Madaffer, so when he shows up, we'll introduce you to him.
Transportation Commission, and I will be the moderator for our first panel. We have 2 speakers on the panel that I'd like to invite up to the stage here. Sorry, just getting the technology figured out here. So, as panelists here, on your right, or my right on your left, is Tony Seba. He's with RethinkX. He's a world-renowned speaker, a #1 selling author, and focuses largely in technology disruptions of various industries. With RethinkX, he's proposed that self-driving cars will dominate the roads by the year 2030, representing all but about 5% of miles driven. That conversation will have a rippling effect throughout the economy, insurance, auto sales, personal productivity, and as part of that, RethinkX is assuming that level 5 fully autonomous vehicles will be in production within the next 3 years. Nick Zanjani is director with the Director of Consumer Protection and Enforcement with the California Public Utilities Commission. Nick and I have worked together for a long time. After earning his master's degree at the London School of Economics, he was a Jesse Unruh Assembly Fellow, so many of you have probably worked with him in the Capitol as well. He began working with the CPUC in legislative affairs in 2011 and has since moved on to his current role as Director of Consumer Protection and Enforcement. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Nick first to open our panel on transportation technology and the pros and cons of this new emerging technology.
Thank you very much, Curtis. I appreciate the warm introduction. It's great to be here. I see a lot of familiar faces that I've worked with over my course of time working in the legislature, so it's good to see all of you. Good to see former legislators that I've worked with as well, and always good to see you, Curtis. Curtis and I got started in state government at around the same time, so it's wonderful to be sharing this event with him. I am the Director of Consumer Protection and Enforcement at the Public Utilities Commission. One of the 3 branches that I'm responsible for is the Transportation Enforcement Branch, which oversees all prearranged paid transportation for profit in the state of California. One thing to note is we don't have jurisdiction over taxis, and it's a little bit of an oddity in state government because most people who regulate transportation in other states have the whole kit and caboodle. In California, if you have a service type that is able to be hailed off the street, that you're able to step into, that counts as a taxi, and it's not counted as prearranged transportation, so it doesn't fall under the auspices of the PUC. I know a lot of people think of the PUC as mostly an energy regulatory commission, but we have had transportation from the very beginning. We started off as the Railroad Commission, and so transportation runs in our blood. So, with that said, I have been involved in helping shape the TNC industry from the beginning, and it's been a great pleasure because it's the one industry that has been created and had been developing since I started working for the Public Utilities Commission, and it's really disrupted the entire transportation industry and will continue to in the years to come. I was very fortunate to be able to participate in the Phase 1 drafting of the decision that introduced TNCs into state parlance and really national and international parlance, and then to help with the bill that implemented it into state statute and developments since then. I won't get too much into the details of all the history of how TNCs came to be. I know Tony's going to talk about that a little bit in his presentation, but since the focus of this meeting is really to talk about what's going to happen in the future, how our lives are going to change as a result of the introduction of this technology, I'll prognosticate a little bit, and I'll flavor it with a little bit of PUC spice, because I think while the transportation aspect of what the PUC has traditionally regulated didn't have a lot of connection with the energy side, the climate change side of things that the PUC is traditionally known for, I think in the near future, things are going to converge, and they're going to converge very, very quickly. When it comes to the transportation innovation and the TNC industry, and for those of you who don't know, that stands for Transportation Network Company. I'm talking about Ubers, Lyfts, former sidecar, et cetera, et cetera. So TNCs right now, mostly combustion engine vehicles, not autonomous vehicles, but in the very, very near future, we're heading towards a future that is both autonomous and electric. Everybody knows it's coming. In California, we have an EV mandate that's going to ratchet up. The DMV has already passed its initial set of AV regs, and they're working on their new ones that are going to come out this year. So we're going to very, very quickly see autonomous vehicles, and once these vehicles are completely street legal and fully permitted, and everything is fine from the perspective of the California DMV and from NHTSA on the federal level, then it transfers to the PUC's jurisdiction because it is prearranged paid transportation, even if it does not have a driver. So the PUC has an open proceeding right now for transportation-related issues. It's the same open proceeding that was used to introduce the TNC business model in the first place. And one of the tracks, currently track 8 in our open Phase 3B, sorry, I'm talking regulatory speak, is to examine what the PUC should do in regards to autonomous vehicles moving forward, once they are fully deployed, once they're street legal, and being utilized by the likes of Uber, Lyft, et cetera, to make money and transport passengers. So there will be a variety of challenges to tackle in regards to AVs. A lot of the safety-related things will be handled in advance by DMV, NHTSA, et cetera. But what really interests me moving forward is when these AVs become fully electric and we have fleets that are largely going to replace the transportation that are personally owned vehicles. And this is the holy grail for the TNC industry. Right now, are they making money? I don't know. This time last year, they weren't making money. In the first half of 2016, the press says that Uber lost $1.2 billion. This time last year, Lyft said it was sustaining losses of $50 million a month, and that was okay, as long as it didn't go too far above that. Hopefully this year they're making some money. But regardless, it's not that important because the companies are playing for the long game. And the long game is removing the drivers from the equation altogether. If you remove drivers from the equation, you immediately get rid of at least 80% of the cost right there. And when you remove that much of the cost, suddenly it doesn't make sense for people to own their own vehicles anymore because the cost of transportation by using the likes of Uber and Lyft and autonomous vehicles will be so cheap that it just makes sense to utilize those vehicles instead of vehicles that you yourself own. When you talk to the founders of some of these TNC companies, they're very clear that this is the trajectory that they want to go in. And once they get to that point, they're going to be making money hand over fist. So that's the perspective from the TNC industry. Then you have the perspective from the automobile manufacturers. The automobile manufacturers are scared out of their minds. They've already seen a decline in car ownership and car purchases. For people of my parents' generation, it wasn't uncommon to own 4 cars. My generation, 2. Millennials, 1, maybe 0. It's just less and less interest in car ownership. And so, the automobile manufacturers are looking for a market, and the market is naturally going to be these autonomous vehicles that are able to transport people. It keeps them relevant. So, this is the trend that we're heading in, and because we have an EV mandate, all the smart AV manufacturers are going to be using autonomous vehicles that are also all electric vehicles. So what does that mean? We're going to suddenly have millions, in very short order, millions and millions of autonomous electric vehicles going around at any given time. This will create a lot of challenges. I know Edison is in the room. The Edisons and PG&Es and SDG&Es of the world are going to have to find ways to be able to provide power to power up these cars. But the opportunity is tremendous in regards to having these cars on the road. Because just think about it. There's a lot of, for example, concern around things like the duck curve in Cal ISO parlance and over-generation of power at certain times of the day in certain seasons. Well, if you have millions of essentially battery storage around the state at any given time, and you have sophisticated telecommunications infrastructure and software incorporated into all those vehicles, you can have your grid operator essentially send signals to these autonomous vehicles. Oh, we need you to suck power off the grid. We need to balance the grid. And you can have a price signal that sends those autonomous vehicles to powering stations to pull power off the grid, potentially at cut rates, as a courtesy, because the grid needs that to stay balanced. Similarly, you could see autonomous electric vehicles being told through signals, through telecommunication signals in the grids and the utility companies to essentially provide the power that allows you to island in the event of an outage, that allows you to use the battery storage in those autonomous vehicles if they're not otherwise being utilized for transportation purposes, to smooth over peak demand, to get to that point where we don't have to rely as much on peaker plants. So we don't have to procure as much energy to help us serve peak demand, to help us transition from that time between when solar goes down and wind picks up, so that we have something that fills in the gaps that's not simply driven by rate design or other factors that the PUC is currently exploring to solve for this problem. If you have millions upon millions of autonomous electric vehicles, all of this can be done automatically through signals and software. And that's a tremendous benefit to all of us, because if we can get rid of peaker plants, that's a huge benefit in regards to reducing emissions. That's a huge benefit to helping us meet our climate change goals. And that's just the small portion of what is to offer when we have autonomous electric vehicles. If we have autonomous electric vehicles, it's not just that benefit, it's also the benefit of having cars more generally removed from the road. A statistic that Tony will talk about that also is being trumpeted by the likes of Lyft's co-founder is that cars that we own remain unutilized 96% of the time. So if you have something that's only utilized 4% of the time, it's tremendously wasteful. You don't need that. And so you have cars sitting in parking lots, sitting in garages, sitting in your driveways, clogging up the streets. There will be dramatically less of that in the future. You might be able to get rid of roads. You might be able to create parks in the spaces they once occupied. You might be able to create businesses in that space, et cetera, et cetera. There will be tremendous changes, and we're only scratching the surface of what's possible right now. So I do see a future that's bright. There are certainly a lot of technical challenges to overcome, questions to ask. But I think this is the vision we have to realize and strive towards, and just be aware is coming, because we need to prepare for it and realize that it's happening. The transportation revolution, the electrification of vehicles and the introduction of autonomous vehicles and the widespread use of TNC applications will be the defining technological achievement of this generation. I have a 2-year-old son, and I came to the realization recently that he'll probably never own a vehicle. That's pretty remarkable. So in the same way that the current generation has seen the explosion and proliferation of telecommunications devices, and the generation before that saw television, phones, et cetera, come into the house, I think transportation is the defining issue right now. So I'll cut it off there. Thank you very much for the time, and hand it over to Tony.
Thank you. I don't know if I need a microphone. Yeah, online. Okay, got it. Do we have the presentation? Excellent. Thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction. Awesome. So I want to take you into the future of transportation. Now the future, I'm going to close with when the future is. But before I do that, I want to take you into the past. This is New York City, 1900, Easter Parade. Can anyone see the one car in that picture? One car. There is one car. We used horses for our main means of transportation for thousands of years. There is one car, right? There it is. That's 1900. 1913, can anyone see the one horse in that picture? 13 years, that's all it took. And this is called a disruption. And if somebody had stood up there, here, in 1900 and said, in 13 years, 95% of vehicles on the road are going to be this thing called internal combustion engine automobile, they would have called him or her insane, right? But yet it did happen, and that is what's called a disruption, and that's my field of work. What is a technology disruption? Essentially when a set of technologies make it possible for entrepreneurs and companies to create products and services that do two things. One is they create new markets, think Uber, and two, they either destroy or dramatically transform existing industries. Think digital cameras versus film, which digital transformed, destroyed film. So let me take you to 85 to give you an idea that it's usually, so in 85, the then largest telecom company in history on earth, AT&T, essentially hired McKinsey & Company, consulting company, and they asked them one question. This thing called the cell phone, you know, £2 and $8 per minute for talking and so on, what's going to be the adoption in 15 years, by the year 2000? So McKinsey went off and did whatever it is that they do, and their 15-year prediction was 900,000. The real number was 109 million. This is not a small mistake, right? You know, my little dog, if I had one, would do better. This is a factor, I did have one, but 120 times, right? So because they failed to invest, essentially, AT&T got disrupted. the landline telephony business. They didn't get into the new world of cell phones and internet and so on, and it missed out on multi-trillion-dollar opportunities. If you just look at these 7 companies, they're worth $3 trillion. I mean, AT&T missed out on the generation of trillions of dollars, and many of these companies are based right here in California in big part because we were the disruptors, right? And usually it's the experts and the insiders who will tell you not going to happen or not going to happen that quickly. And these are very smart people. So it's usually the smart people, the very smart people who are the insiders who will dismiss disruptive opportunities. And when I say disruptive opportunities for states, for countries, for cities. So a lot of my work is to answer this question: why do smart people and smart organizations consistently fail to anticipate market disruptions? Consistently. So over the last dozen years or so, I've developed a new framework to not just forecast the past disruptions, anybody can do that, but to anticipate disruptions. And essentially I'll walk you through some of the thinking and then I'll get into transportation. So technology cost curves. Technologies have an improvement rate that is well known generally in public information, and this is Moore's Law, that's an example, and that's what built Silicon Valley. All of Silicon Valley is based on Moore's Law. And what it says is essentially that the cost of computing, essentially the power of computing, improves by about 41% per year for the same dollar. So, pretty much if you compound 41%, this costs $600. The computing power of this 20 years ago would have been $600,000. 40 years ago, $600 million. 60 years ago, $600 billion. So the power of improving technologies is that we think linearly, generally, but technologies improve exponentially in general. Convergence. People talk about disruptive technologies, but in fact, what is disruptive is when they converge. When the smartphone came out, and 10 years ago, does anyone not have a smartphone? Does anyone know anyone who doesn't have a smartphone? And yet, 10 years ago, folks said, who would ever buy a $600 phone because you could buy the $100 Nokia. Remember Nokia? Gone, right? But the smartphone was possible because of the convergence of a number of technologies, all of which were improving at different rates. And they converged at this point in time, 2007, and it's no coincidence that both Apple and Google came up with a smartphone 2007. That's somebody was going to, and it just turned out to be Apple and Google. Business model innovation is just as important as technology innovation. Uber, for instance, TNCs, Uber last year had more bookings than the whole taxi industry in America. Uber, than the whole. So anybody who tells you that a disruption cannot happen in transportation in 10 years, well, they did it in 8. I mean, Uber was started in 2009. So ask a taxi driver if a disruption can happen in 8 years. And in New York City, there are 500,000 rides in TNCs every day. Every single day, 500,000. And this is doubling every year. So business model innovation is disruptive and can be when the right convergence happens. So a few years ago, 3.5 years ago, I published a book based on this framework. I wanted to basically say, let's apply it into energy and transportation. And that book was called, Clean Disruption of Energy and Transportation. I'm going to talk about the transportation side. And I've done further work with a new think tank that I co-founded called RethinkX. And I'm going to talk about the technologies and the business model that are going to disrupt all of energy and transport and how soon. So is the electric vehicle disruptive? Or is it just a nice thing to have for climate reasons and so on? I'll give you 3 reasons. I can give you 9 or 10, but this is your car if you don't have an EV. It has 2,000 moving parts, 2,000 moving parts. The EV has 20 20, right? So it's 1% of the moving parts, which means maintenance is essentially almost free, at least 10x cheaper than the internal combustion engine. EVs are also 10 times cheaper depending on the cost of both gasoline and or diesel and electricity, 5 to 10 times cheaper to fuel on a per mile basis. So again, think film cameras versus digital cameras. Once you, if you know what a film camera is, that is, every time you basically took a picture with a film, you burned film, gasoline, you burned money. And that's what we do with gasoline or diesel. But with digital, essentially it's free. Once you buy the camera, it's free. Every picture is free. It's almost like that with electric vehicles. It's 10 times cheaper to fuel, to maintain, and so on. And this is something that nobody talks about for some reason. An EV can last 500,000 miles. Easy, 500,000 miles. Of course, it's not interesting when you own a car, because the average American drives 10 to 12,000 miles a year. It would take us 50 years to drive essentially the lifetime of an EV, so it's not interesting in an individual ownership model. But that is going to change, and I'll show you why this is disruptive. And in fact, companies are building the million-mile EV, million miles, which would take 100 years for individuals to drive. So 3+ years ago, I published this, and I said, based on the cost curves of batteries and so on, this is going to be basically what the market is going to offer in terms of electric vehicles. And what I said was by 2018, 2017, the market is going to offer unsubsidized 200-mile range, and 200 is the minimum that you need to go to the mainstream market, in the $35,000 to $40,000 price range. And of course, at the time, I was called insane, right? Now we have two. I mean, yesterday we had Tesla basically launch the Tesla Model 3, $35,000. It's smack in the range. The GM Bolt, $37,500, no subsidies, right? And more companies are coming in, and if you continue by the way, the cost curve is actually accelerating. It's happening even more quickly than I said in 2014. What this tells you is that by 2022, you're going to have $20,000 versions of the Tesla Model 3. $20,000 by 2022. So think about it. You know, by 2020, you're going to have EVs, 200-mile range, that are cheaper to buy, maybe 20% cheaper, sticker price, 90% cheaper to fuel, 90% cheaper to maintain. They're more powerful. I mean, the Tesla Model 3 is as powerful as a Porsche. Why would you buy anything else? I mean, it's more powerful and cheaper and better. And you can actually, you know, store electricity. So the right economic choice, essentially by 2025, there won't be diesel or gasoline car made, period, according to this curve, right? Now, we still have 1 billion cars on the road, and it's going to take a while to turn over. Now, I'm going to tell you why this is actually not going to be the case, but if we preserve the model of individual ownership, it would be the case. Autonomous vehicles are even more disruptive, and they're going to enable the big disruption. And so I'm going to walk you through the progress that's been made in autonomous vehicles. There are more than 44 corporations. Now, this is not just startup companies. These are corporations working on autonomous vehicles. 3 years ago, it would have been a handful. Now they get it. Now they get how disruptive this is going to be. And I've been actually on self-driving cars in companies that are not here. So, you know, we know there are more than this. According to Tesla, they will have a level 5, and I won't go, I assume that we all know what level 4 and 5 are. Basically, Tesla by 2019. And there's a number of companies that claim to be almost at level 4. Audi just came out at level 3, Tesla's already at level 3, and so on and so forth. For our purposes, my purposes, I assume 2021. I assume that Tesla or somebody else. And by the way, all you need is one. All you need is one company to come up with level 4 or 5 in order for this to be enabled. Because essentially autonomous vehicles are computers on wheels. You don't need 40 operating systems, all you need is one, right? So what's the cost? I'm gonna quickly show you one key technology, computing. Basically you need super computing power to run a self-driving car. And just to give you an idea, this was the world's most powerful computer in the year 2000. Sandia National Labs. It cost about $50 million, 1 teraflops, whatever 1 teraflops is, right? 1 teraflops, $50 million. This is the CEO of NVIDIA showing the 8 teraflop computer. That's $600, right? 8 teraflops. So this is an improvement of almost 1 million times since the year 2000. This is all you need to run a self-driving car. 8 teraflops of GPU power, of computing power. And there it is, $600. And it gets better. By the end of this year, NVIDIA is going to come up with a 20 teraflop, 3 times more powerful by the end of this year. And according to them, we will see a 1,000 time improvement by 2025. 1,000 time improvement in computing power that drives basically vehicles by 2025. So this is all cool. Now, if we all own a self-driving car and tweet or Instagram or Facebook, so what? I mean, who cares, right? Where is the real disruption? We call it transport as a service, TaaS. So essentially, as a middle class, our second largest capital expenditure in life is basically cars. The average median new cars in America is $33,000. We spend $10,000 to $12,000 a year in cars, right? Those of us who, I don't own a car, I've not owned a car in 10 years, but those who do, because it doesn't make economic sense, I got that a long time ago, but they're actually used only 4% of the time. And in my book, 4% asset utilization, whether it's for peakers or for cars, is a disruption waiting to happen. And in fact, I'll walk you through the disruption. The disruption is going to be the convergence, just like a number of technologies converged in 2007 to make the smartphone happen. Electric, autonomous, and ride-hailing, TNCs, when they converge, and I'm saying 2021, when you have level 4 or 5, essentially, cars, instead of driving 4% of the time, they're going to drive 40% plus. I mean, some companies are saying 60 or 80%, but let's assume a 10x improvement, 40%. So the vehicle utilization goes up 10x. Now vehicles can drive 100,000 miles per year. Okay, so over 5 years, essentially, you can use 1 electric vehicle if you're a TNC, or you can use 3 internal combustion engine automobiles. Suddenly, on a per mile basis, essentially, it doesn't make sense, economic sense, to use internal combustion engine. I mean, we did the numbers for autonomous ICE versus autonomous EVs, and it's a no-brainer. So the Ubers and the Lyfts and the DDs are going to have to go with electric, or they can't survive. They won't be able to compete because, essentially, just because EVs go 500,000 miles, essentially that overwhelms. That's 60% cheaper on a per mile basis than ICE vehicles, and that doesn't even include 90% less in maintenance, 90% less in fuel, and so on and so forth. So when autonomous, the key enabler to electrification of transportation is autonomous vehicles. That's the key enabler. So assume 2021, autonomous vehicles are approved for road transportation to carry people and goods and so on. That day, the cost per mile of AEVs, autonomous electric vehicles, is going to be up to 10 times cheaper than the cost of buying a new car. 10 times cheaper. That's a 10x. Every single time there's been a 10x difference in cost in similar products or services in history. I only go to 1454, so until that history, there's been a disruption every single time. So 10x difference in cost on day one. So 2021, someone is going to go and think, okay, do I want to spend 50 grand over the next 5 years in a new car, or do I want to spend on demand, like Netflix, right, and Uber and so on demand, $1,000 to $2,000 a year? No brainer, right? Do I want to own a car, or do I want to send my kids to school? No brainer. I mean, every time there's been a 10x, there's been a disruption. And so essentially that's going to happen in 2021. And this is going to enable the biggest disruption we've seen in a long time, and ever. Essentially, we calculate that by 2030, 95% of all miles in America are going to be autonomous electric on demand. 95%. Now, 40% of cars are still going to be individually owned, but they're only going to contribute 5% of the miles because they're only going to be driven 10 to 12,000 miles a year. 60% of cars are going to be TAS, autonomous electric, and they're going to contribute 95% of miles, and this is going to happen for purely economic reasons. Consumers are going to make the right economic choice, which is to go with a cheaper option by 10x. In fact, TAS is going to be 4 times cheaper than running a car that you already own. So if your uncle gives you a car for free, that's going to be 4 times more expensive to operate than basically AEV. 4 times. So the ration, but why would you want to pay that, right? You may want to do it for a little while, and then you're done with it. So what's going to happen? What's going to happen is, because we have cars driving around 10 times longer, 40% instead of 4% of the time, the vehicle fleet is going to be 80% smaller. We're going to need 80% fewer cars on the road because of this transportation, the TAS disruption. 80%, think about that. And there are huge implications for across the value chain, and we can talk about that. Oil is going to peak 2020 and then go down in, basically from 100 million to 70 million barrels. Oil prices are going to collapse immediately. Implications for basically society. Parking is going to be obsolete. 80–90% of all parking is going to be basically vacant. And I did the numbers for LA. In the parking that's going to be vacant in LA because of transport as a service, you'll be able to fit in 3 cities the size of San Francisco. 3. So that's in the empty, vacant space in Los Angeles. So Los Angeles is going to have to make this decision. Do we want this big piece of desert, you know, basically 180 miles in the middle of the city, or do we want to build the wealth of 3 San Franciscos? And that's coming soon. I mean, that's coming in the early 2020s. And more implications. Financial. The average American family is going to save at least $5,600 per year, maybe up to $9,000, depending on what mode of TAS they use. So you could use TAS as the way we use it now. So if I don't want to share that car with Uber or whatever it is, DD with someone else, I can just take it myself. Or if I want to go with my family, then that's TAS pool. Also buses, by the way, this is not just cars. You're going to have autonomous electric buses. So you're going to have up to 40 people in autonomous electric. And this has implications for public transportation also. So average American family is going to save $5,600 per year by not owning a car and using TAS, which means at the aggregate level in the US, this is going to be $1 trillion savings for American families. This is not to the 1%. This is savings for the average American family of $1 trillion. Consumer spending is 71% of GDP. So this would be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, boost to the economy in history. And on top of that, if we spend the time that we waste driving It took me 3 hours to come from San Francisco yesterday. Now, I didn't drive. I said I don't own a car. I actually took an Uber. Essentially, the productivity increase of teaching when you not drive, or nursing when you not drive, or whatever, is going to be another $1 trillion at the national level. So this is a $2 trillion boost to the economy. Social. For the first time in history, we're going to have 5-10 cent a mile transportation, door to door, and convenient for all. For the first time in history, this will make transportation affordable and convenient for every segment of the population. This ride from San Francisco to here would have cost me $9, maybe $4.50. You know all the figures about folks who can't get a job because they don't have cheap, convenient transportation, or don't get health care because they don't have transportation. For the first time in history, we're going to have cheap, convenient transportation for all, the disabled, the old, the pensioner, the young. I mean, kids can't drive today, right? And so on and so forth. Environmental, 90% decrease in CO2 emissions. 90% decrease in CO2 emission. Now, I remind you, this is going to happen for purely economic reasons. Folks are going to make the right green economic choice, as in this green, and the side effect is going to be the green, climate and emissions and use of materials, because 2,000 parts versus 20, we use less material and so on. And of course, geopolitical. When we don't use oil, essentially for the first time in history, we become a net oil exporter. So there's going to be oil for something else. Essentially, we're not going to need oil, so the geopolitical implications of oil are going to diminish. So let me wrap it up and then take questions. We are here. It's 2017, and we are there, right? All of these things, the convergence is about to happen. 2020, 2021, 2022, that's when the convergence is going to happen. And we better get ready. This is the biggest disruption that we've seen in a century, technology disruption, and it's going to happen very quickly. And it's going to happen very quickly for this reason. People are going to make the right economic choice. It's going to be at 10x. Mainstream analysts are going to tell you that it's going to be a slow kind of change and so on. No technology disruption ever in history happens linearly. It happens always as S-curves, as the smartphone has happened, and so on and so forth. So we're on the cusp of that technology disruption, and we have a lot of choices to make. We have a lot of choices to make right now and right here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Tony and Nick. Before I open it up, I want to ask one question. This is kind of pros and cons of these technologies. If we're moving toward all electric future, we're looking at potentially waste from batteries. So, how do we handle battery waste as a potential con of this?
So, battery waste, you said?
Yes.
So batteries actually can last for decades. And in fact, we see, batteries, you see the automakers now recycling batteries and using them as basically grid storage. And they can last for decades. So they're already being made into grid storage, and there's a degradation. So when they say that, for instance, an electric vehicle, by the time it's 80% of the original capacity, then basically they swap it out. But that is still great for grid storage. And it can last for decades as grid storage. And then, for decades, and then basically the recycling, and a lot of people are recycling it. Lithium is it's like 3% of the weight of a battery, and so on and so forth. So we need to put in place, just like we put in place for electronics, programs to recycle batteries. But batteries last for decades. And by the way, we see here with this disruption about 250 gigawatt hours of batteries getting basically off of cars every year. once this disruption gets underway. 250 gigawatts, just to give you an indication, is 5 times bigger than the Tesla Gigafactory. Basically 10 years of that would be more than enough to store more than a half a day of all the electricity produced in all the United States. And so you want to solve the grid, storage issue with solar and so on. These are the batteries. Of course, we need to have grid storage before that, but these batteries can be used to solve that problem.
I think it's also worth noting that we could have a separate event and presentation very similar to Tony's solely on battery technology alone. We don't know if the batteries that are in existence today are going to be the same batteries that are in existence tomorrow. So, if we're talking about issues that come up as a result of the kind of battery technologies we have today, well, you might see some unfortunate things happening in the future. We might be less involved in oil-rich states of the Middle East as foreign intervention is concerned, but we might be more involved in countries where there's high deposits of lithium, for example. Where are most of the lithium deposits in the world? China, not the friendliest state. Bolivia, very anti-American in its orientation. Afghanistan, do we want to get out of there or do we want to stay? So these are some of the implications just from the lithium battery side of the equation.
Can I say something? The geopolitical implications of lithium are very different from the geopolitical implications of oil. Oil is a flow, right? We need oil every day. If OPEC cuts off oil, basically we can't drive our cars. Now, lithium is a stock, it's an asset. Once you put the lithium in the battery, you can basically drive that car for decades. So even if Bolivia or China or so on cut off the lithium supply, what that means is you can't build new batteries, but the batteries in existence can keep running for decades and decades. And there's a massive difference in the geopolitical implications of that. So just to make that point.
Questions from the audience? Here. Way faster than you. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I appreciated the photos, and I think one of the interesting things about those historic photos was that the street didn't change. And so I'd be interested in any comments about the fact that what we're likely to see in your scenario is a response on the demand side that increases the demand for travel against a backdrop of a transportation system with capacity in terms of the road capacity, even taking into account the closer spacing, et cetera, the operational advantages we might get from full autonomy. That you're on the one hand painting a picture of greater demand, greater travel, ease of travel, which are big benefits, and how the folks in the room especially might think about the capacity, and in particular, the capacity where we have very constrained corridors with bridges or rail transit now providing high capacity links to some of our most valuable real estate. Thank you.
Yep. Good question, or 10 questions. Appreciate that. So today at peak, the most that in America, we use 20 million cars. So in America, we have 250 million or so cars, but at rush hour, if you include all the cars that are going to school, pick up kids at school, plus rush hour, plus whatever, we use 20 million cars. That's peak. And what basically in our numbers, we say that it's going to be 40 plus million cars. So it's going to be more than enough. In terms of road capacity, because we're going to have 80% fewer cars, basically 80% of the roads are going to be, empty most of the time. On top of that, we are distracted. Humans are not great drivers, as you probably know. We kill worldwide 1.3 million people, and in America, 38,000 people every year. So because they use sensors, autonomous vehicles actually drive closer to one another, so they use road space much better. So we're going to have 80% fewer cars, which need 80% less road space, and they drive up to 80% the numbers that we have more efficiently. So we're going to have basically an order of magnitude decreased need for roads. So a lot of the roads that we have today are going to be essentially obsolete. And that doesn't even include the parking space. So the parking, all that parking is going to be empty, 80–90%, especially in the high real estate areas. All that parking is going to empty out right away because of the opportunity cost. And this is another choice that we need to make as a society. You know, in a place like Los Angeles, as you saw, there's going to be a lot of space. All the new cities basically have 30–40% of the land mass. I mean, I was in Fort Worth recently, and 40% of Fort Worth is parking of the land mass. Imagine that, right? So you take in LA is in that vicinity also. 30% of the city is going to be empty, right? What do we do with that? So we don't need more road space, period. And even a lot of the stuff, a lot of the land that we have now used for parking or whatever, we're going to have to reuse. So as a society, we need to make those choices now. Are we going to use them for green parks? Are we going to use them for affordable housing? Are we going to use them for businesses? Well, the answer is probably yes, but in what proportion? So when this disruption happens, it may be too late. You're going to have the lobbies here and, you know, pushing one another to take advantage of that. But now that we know it's coming, and I may be off by a year or two, but I'm not off, essentially. And we need to make those choices now as to how we're going to use that space. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Yeah. 80% fewer cars on the road, 80%. Actually, OECD did a study. They said they studied Lisbon, and they said that 3% of the cars in Lisbon could provide all of the transportation in Lisbon, right? I mean, they had some things cooked into the study, but 3%.
So can I follow up on that? Because I'm struggling a little bit with, I understand that an electric vehicle, useful life, I won't need to replace the vehicle near as often because it could be on the road for 1,000,000 miles versus whatever the useful life of a combustion.
140 to 200, yeah.
Okay, but I have a hard time understanding that that's a direct trade-out. I kind of think I will still be in some vehicle. Hopefully it's autonomous and I don't have to think about the driving. And I understand that an autonomous can shorten the distance between the vehicles so you get better throughput and capacity there. But I don't think it's a net decrease of vehicles on the road. It's just a different vehicle on the road.
It's a net decrease because each vehicle, instead of going 10,000 miles, it goes 100,000 miles, right?
Well, yeah, but I'm still going to ride 100,000 miles.
Yes, yes.
Hypothetically, if I'm this person that's always riding around.
You're going to ride 10,000 miles a year, and then 9 other people are going to ride 10,000 miles, right? In that one vehicle.
So I think it's worth mentioning that you know, when the TAS services, the TNCs started out, it was just you were a sole chartering party. You had exclusive use to that vehicle. Now we have shared services like Uber Pool and Lyft Line, which are particularly popular with millennials, but across the board, they're pretty popular. So I think the open question that will really determine how many cars are taken off the road and the extent to which the streets are utilized in the future is going to be, are people going to utilize these more genuine ride-share type services with multiple individuals you might not necessarily know sharing your vehicles? And then what is going to be the change in regards to autonomous electric buses? What is going to be the change in regards to people more likely to take a TOS type service to their public transit system, like RT here in Sacramento, like BART down in the Bay Area? So these are some of the open questions, but generally speaking, I very much agree with Tony's conclusion that there'll be a dramatic decrease of cars on the road overall.
Can I ask one also? You're sensing that there's some skepticism about the disruption you're talking about is going to lead to less congestion, fewer cars on the road. Okay, so maybe so, but I have some of the concerns the last two questioners had also. You know, for 50 years, the California transportation system has been based on the idea that if we just put more lane miles out there and build bigger local streets and roads, that we're going to ease congestion and people get where they're going to go easier in a more timely fashion and all that. It hasn't worked. We've never been able to build our way out of congestion. If anything, the more lanes we build, the more miles people drive. So it's not, and so why are these very long-standing trends, people driving more, going to change because we're sharing vehicles, as much as you say we're going to?
Yeah, no, I mean, sharing vehicles.
Why won't we just make more trips?
Yeah, sharing, we will have more trips because they will be cheaper, right? And actually, in our scenario, there are going to be 50% more miles because they're going to be cheaper. So basically, by 2030, in our scenario, there are going to be 50% more miles because a lot of folks, the elderly and the disabled and the young and so on, who don't have access to transportation well. And because it's going to be cheaper, a lot more people are going to drive more and so on. There are counters to that, which is that we may not go to the mall as often because there are going to be these cars that are going to bring stuff to us and so on and so forth, right? But I don't want to complicate that conversation. But essentially, we are going to have a world because again, people are going to pay 10 times cheaper. But in our scenario, we don't share necessarily the car. We put in the same number. Half the trips are going to be individuals in the Uber or whatever, and half of the trips are going to be pool. And pool includes, maybe your family, maybe a bus with 40 people, maybe, a Starbucks on wheels, for instance. So there's going to be new business models where, Starbucks or whoever is going to say, if I can take 10 people from San Francisco to Palo Alto, and that trip is going to cost me, 40 cents per person, I'll give it for free as long as you drink your, coffee for that hour. And so for them, it may make more sense. Actually, it does make more sense to have this Starbucks on wheels than to have a downtown, paying the rents downtown and so on. So miles are going to increase, and we bake that into here. We don't need to share the vehicle all the time. Actually, the assumptions that we made are exactly the vehicle utilization today. We said half are going to be individuals, just not sharing that ride, right? Ride sharing is different from vehicle sharing, right? You're going to be by yourself, just like I was yesterday coming to Sacramento, and the other half are going to be pools, whether it's 2 people, 5 people, 10 people, 40 people. And we bake that in, and that's what we got.
I want to also mention that so far we've been talking about individuals traveling places and individual behavior, but we're also in the midst of a large change that will also impact individual miles traveled in regards to other aspects of the economy. For example, people were much more likely just 5-10 years ago to visit brick and mortar stores, individuals driving their cars, buying your goods and services. A huge amount of that business is now being done by Amazon that can more efficiently just bring things to your doorstep. I've lived in the Middle East and Europe for a significant amount of time, and it's very popular, at least in Europe, to have a home delivery service of groceries. I can anticipate in the United States that being more and more popular in years to come, especially in autonomous vehicles. It'll be less convenient, honestly, to not own your own vehicle and want to go pick up your groceries and things. It's easier to just have it dropped at your doorstep and be home to take that order. So some of these things will be able to realize more efficiencies, and that will result in less people going back and forth to particular locations, and that will take vehicles off the road, and that will decrease total number of vehicles traveled. Another impact I think it's worth mentioning is that if suddenly you get rid of all your parking space and you're building something like housing to replace it, it's possible that suddenly people can actually live closer to the places that they work, and there could be less of a need to live further out. I work in San Francisco. Rent is completely unaffordable for a normal person who doesn't make a 6-figure income. If there were more housing, which is the ultimate thing, the decrease in supply that's driving up the cost of housing in the city and across the Bay Area, if there's more housing able to be built, that could actually incentivize people to travel less. So there are a lot of X factors at play that could determine also the number of vehicle miles traveled.
Tony, one last question from Commissioner Madaffer.
Thank you, and I've been told to go quick, so I will. And I just want to say, you two, Tony and Nick, you should get your show on the road and go everywhere. because I just agree with everything you said, and I think that probably just a little bit more time explaining some of the background. A couple ideas. One thing I think you should stress more is that 43,000 people died on our highways in 2016. The goal of autonomy is to take that number to zero, or as close to zero as possible. You mentioned just now, Nick, I'd written it down earlier, the parking requirements. It's ridiculous. Municipalities require so much parking today, which is such valuable land, which ties to affordability on housing. And this is a solution that nobody is following right now. And I think we should start legislatively to get folks to start getting cities to think about eliminating some of these ridiculous parking requirements, especially in the urban core. Lastly, I think you ought to spend a little bit more time, as I said, on how more people will likely not own a car in the future because of shared mobility. You talked about EVs, and I totally agree, but I think you need to share more a little bit. The fact of the matter is, the new model is you're not going to buy a car 15 years from now. It's going to be something that GM owns or one of the manufacturers, and you're going to use it. There was, lastly, a study in Berlin that you could emphasize where it showed that the work of 9 cars on the road today will be done by 1 car tomorrow, and it's a very well documented study that I'd encourage you to look at, and I think it would help some of the doubters that you need to convince that haven't had the benefit of reading this extra information. So thank you.
I'll just make one really quick note on parking. This will be a challenge for cities as well, because obviously, if you have autonomous vehicles, even if you don't own them, they need to park somewhere when they're not being utilized. And if they're autonomous electric vehicles, they need to charge somewhere when they need to charge. So there's the question too, where do you do that? So there's a variety of models that people are going to have to explore, and the utilities will play a very large role in determining this future, but are we going to be utilizing curb space with charging of autonomous vehicles, whether it happens autonomously or not? That's a question. Are we going to be utilizing some of the existing parking space to build mega garages that are essentially huge energy nodes that are staffed by people who plug the cars in, clean the cars while they're charging, et cetera, et cetera? These are some questions to also think about in regards to how these autonomous electric vehicles are going to charge and park.
Thank you, Tony and Nick.
Pleasure.
We're out of time on the panel here.
Let me just close this one. Cars are going to be owned by fleets, not individuals, right? I mean, that's an essential thing in transport as a service. Just like movies now are owned by, Netflix and Amazon and so on, we don't buy DVDs or whatever, and music the same way. So essentially, it's a fleet model. We don't need to build out an infrastructure of individual chargers in the middle of the city. Uber or somebody, or Ford or GM, is going to own 1 million cars, and they're basically going to deploy them all over, where the need is and so on, and they're going to charge them out of the real heavy, expensive real estate areas, and think, mass transit. Basically, they're going to be close to, where they can get high voltage electricity and charge hundreds or thousands of cars at a time. Cars are going to be owned by fleets, not individuals. So when we plan for this future, we need to plan for fleets, not individuals, and they're going to have to build their own infrastructure. As opposed to, we're thinking about the curb so the Ubers and the fleet and the Fords and so on are going to build their own. They're going to have to, because again, this is an economic issue. It's going to happen for purely economic reasons. So we need to ease the regulatory process for them to do that. But they are going to do that outside of the core of the city at night, when they're done moving people and done moving goods.
Thank you, Tony, and thank you, Nick, for a very thought-provoking opening to this. I'm going to turn it over to Eric Thronson, who's going to start talking about the community impacts of technology.
Good Lord. We could just talk to those guys all day. I'm afraid this is what's going to happen. So when we were thinking about putting on this forum, Technology Transportation Forum, and how disruptive it could be, we got 732 different ideas, I think, of how transportation is going to be disrupted by technology. And we had to narrow it down to one day because Well, commission staff are not superhuman, and while we have regular jobs, we were trying to do this on the side, and so we're doing the best we can. I'm really sorry that we had to cut that last panel short, but if we're trying to stay on time to give every panelist the opportunity to talk, and so I would like to suggest that anybody, either watching the webcast or in the audience who has additional questions, please let us know, and we will get them to the panelists, and we will get answers, we'll get you in touch, and we will make this work. And I would also suggest, while I may get ahead of my bosses, this may not be the last transportation technology forum that the commission will put on, and so hopefully we will be able to dig deeper into all of these issues individually, maybe as separate day-long or segment-long issues to talk about. So again, my name is Eric Thronson. I'm with the California Transportation Commission, and I think that we got a good start to the forum, but now we're moving on to panel 2, where we will talk about the community impacts, a few of the community impacts of transportation technology. And joining me today are two great guys, and I'm going to introduce them really quickly, then give them a few minutes to talk, and then hopefully turn it over and have more time for questions in this panel. So first with me is Michael Ford from the City of Oakland. He is the interim manager of the city's Parking and Mobility Division in the city's Department of Transportation. He oversees programs ranging from curb management and parking enforcement to shared mobility, transportation demand, and wayfinding. In 2016, he led the city's response to the U.S. DOT's Smart City Challenge, if some of you are familiar with that, using an open, crowdsourced approach that attracted national attention. And in addition, next to him, Eric Silo with Southern California Edison, where he's currently a program manager in the Air and Climate Group, focused on transportation electrification policy and investment strategy. His role is centered on advancing the utility's role in accelerating transportation electrification through developing charging infrastructure deployment strategies, facilitating programs to incentivize greater EV adoption, and influencing emerging state regulatory policies related to the electrification of the transportation system. Both panelists will speak for a little bit. Eric is going to go first because he actually has a PowerPoint, and then Michael will follow up, and then after that we will create the opportunity for questions. Also, I want to remind folks on the webcast that if you have questions, you can email them to us at ctc@dot.ca.gov, and we will try to fit those in as well. We have a staff here who's manning that email address, so shoot them our way, and we will do what we can to make sure we talk to all of you. So with that, I turn it over to Eric.
Great, thanks, Eric. So I want to start out and just say that SCE believes in a clean energy future in which we're fueling clean electric vehicles. We're across the state. We're increasing ride sharing, we're increasing automation, and we're increasing electrification not only in all of the transportation sectors and vehicle classes, but more broadly as well. And we're firmly committed to achieving California's climate goals as well as our local air quality requirements, and that's where I'm going to focus today. So, to date, California's climate goals have really focused on carbon reductions in the electricity sector. And we've done a really good job. SCE's current renewable portfolio standard stands at 28%, but our emissions-free generation is around 37%. So this includes some hydro and some nuclear that is not in the RPS. However, the electricity sector only accounts for about 20% of the GHG emissions in the state. So if you see the big chunk in there is transportation. If you include the refining processes for transportation, GHG emissions associated with the transportation sector increase to about 50%. And so there's no way that we're going to get to California's goals of 80% below 1990 without addressing the transportation sector. So of that transportation sector, about 3/4 of it is associated, those GHG emissions are associated with light-duty vehicles. The remainder are made up by the medium, heavy-duty, and non-road vehicles. And so really when we're talking about GHG, it's a light-duty vehicle play. Increasingly challenging, or even more challenging than the GHG emissions in the state, are the local air quality requirements. SCE is unique in this regard because we serve two air basins, the only 2 air basins in the entire nation that are in severe non-attainment for ozone, the South Coast Air Quality Management District and the San Joaquin Valley Air Quality Management District. And this really has to do with the fact of the medium and heavy duty and non-road vehicles within these areas. So again, as you can see on this chart, transportation plays a big role in reducing these local air toxics. And mainly, this is associated with those heavy-duty diesel trucks that are going through our communities. And so, again, with the state policy goals focused on carbon, you're not gonna get to the local air quality reductions just by that, because that carbon goal, as I mentioned before, is really focused on the light-duty sector, and this is focused on the heavy-duty sector. And then, also, the focus on the electricity sector specifically, you're not going to get to these air quality targets. As an example of that, replacing a heavy-duty truck with an electric vehicle, zero-emission truck, will reduce 60 times more NOx emissions than increasing renewables or increasing energy efficiency on a kilowatt-hour basis. And that's simply because when you increase renewables or you increase energy efficiency, you're offsetting an already pretty clean energy source, where when you're switching from diesel over to electric, you're offsetting a very, very dirty source. So because of the goods movement happening in Southern California, coming through the ports of Long Beach and the ports of LA, and all of the distribution centers and all of the vehicles and trucks that are moving those goods from the Los Angeles basin out to the rest of the country, we have an acute impact of those emissions in Southern California. And in fact, Southern California, Edison's territory, houses 45% of the state's disadvantaged communities. And that's really an impact of those trucks. So as you can see on this chart, those pink areas are all of the areas that are disadvantaged communities, and they line up pretty well along the highways and along the freight corridors coming from the Port of Long Beach out to the distribution centers and then out to the rest of the state. Now, converting to clean zero-emission electric vehicles in the freight sector and the goods movement sector will eliminate those tailpipe emissions in those communities. So that would just be a complete elimination of zero tailpipe. And unlike competing alternative fuels that are near zero, they're just not zero in these communities. And when we're talking about the increases in goods movement and the increased flow of trucks and vehicles within these communities, it's just not good enough for those communities. So some of the things that SCE is doing, we are committed to those statewide and local goals. And so in January, we filed for a comprehensive package of over $570 million to address affordability, availability, and awareness challenges of electric vehicles and accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles across all of the vehicle classes. So I'm happy to talk about this in detail, either in questions or afterwards, but I'll just sort of give you a quick rundown of what that portfolio looks like. We have light-duty incentives for EV ride sharing to incentivize rideshare drivers to drive EVs. We have rebates for residential home charging stations. And we're also proposing to install DC fast charging stations within urban communities or more densely populated communities so that people that don't have residential places to charge will have a place to charge. This is really focused on street parkers or apartment dwellers. And then a complete charging infrastructure package for medium, heavy duty, and non-road vehicles over the course of 5 years. And this is really focused on trucks, buses, forklifts, and other non-road port equipment. And then because we're a utility, obviously focused very much on rates, we have a rate proposal to make sure that the operating costs of those medium and heavy duty vehicles are more cost effective than current rates to really incentivize the use of those vehicles. So this is the proposal that we have, and there's similar proposals by PG&E in San Diego, gas and electric, but this is really just the first step. And we're going to need more policies and more regulations like SB 350, which really codified the utility role in accelerating the adoption of electric vehicles and led to these filings. Those are still needed, but also a suite of programs that, again, address those barriers of affordability, availability of charging and of the vehicles, and awareness to really get the speed, scope, and scale that we need in the short time frame in order to achieve our 2030, 2040, and 2050 climate and local air quality goals. So look forward to chatting more about sort of policy and regulatory issues, and then happy to take any questions on anything SCE or utilities are doing specifically. Thanks.
Go ahead.
Great. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here again. Michael Ford from the City of Oakland's new Department of Transportation. We're exactly 1 month and 2 days old. And I have the pleasure of being the department's first interim manager of our Parking and Mobility Division. And I was thinking I would prepare slides and everything like that, but I knew with the other panelists that were at this workshop that I couldn't compete. So I thought what I would do is try to add value by building on things that I was hearing and emphasizing my experience and how it resonates with some of the topics that we're covering today. Speaking of building on, when I saw Tony's provocative pictures showing 1900 with all of the horses, and then 13 years later where all of the horses were replaced by cars, after thinking about that for a couple of minutes, it dawned on me that the first parking meter was not introduced until 1935. So how did we regulate curb space between 1913 and 1935? And I point that out because I think it speaks to the enormous lift that we have over the next 13 years. If what we're talking about is this massive disruption, I think that there are technologies and policies that we haven't even dreamed of that we're going to have to come up with in order to harness this disruptive change in the transportation industry. And then riffing on Nick's comment and your 2-year-old son, right? He's not sure if his son is going to ever own a vehicle. I have a 19-year-old daughter who's still training for her driver's license, and I don't think she's ever going to own a private vehicle. And I could honestly say that because I'm leading the city's efforts to introduce alternatives to private vehicle ownership and to accelerate the introduction of platforms that will enable people to shed their private vehicles. So in my family of 5, we have 2 vehicles right now, but we're already talking about eliminating one of them. Knowing that we now have the option of using bike share. The station was literally installed 2 days ago in our neighborhood, and then various forms of car share, and then a very robust transit system. So this disruption is happening now. It's here. And the other thing I wanted to pick up on, I'm a parking guy. I've been working for the City of Oakland for a little less than 5 years, and the City of Oakland, like many California cities, depends on the revenue that's generated from its parking supply. So I oversee operations that are responsible for generating nearly $55 million in fees and taxes. So if what we heard earlier this morning is coming our way, that means I probably have a window of about 5 to 10 years where I can take, there you go, thanks Tony, 5, yeah. Where I can literally, it'll be like hospice, right? Where we're basically putting to rest a sustainable municipal enterprise that's been in the Oakland charter, city charter since 1955. It's one of 2 municipal enterprises that are chartered in the city's bylaws. The other one is the Port of Oakland, and one of them is the off-street parking program. And so what I'm looking at is how we can actually leverage that existing infrastructure, the revenues that it generates, to transfer that value into accelerating the development of clean, equitable, economically sustainable initiatives in the form of active transportation, shared mobility, electrification, and always trying to balance the needs of residents, visitors and commuters to the Oakland commercial districts. So, the game on. I mean, so it's happening right now. And then I wanted to pick up one of the comments that the commissioner pointed out this morning in your opening comments. And forgive me, I can't see your name, so I can't. Chris. So Chris, thank you for pointing out the importance of leadership. And it's actually one of the points that I did prepare for today, where I wanted to emphasize that as all of the policymakers and shakers in the room, to recognize that cities like Oakland and other Bay Area cities and cities around the state are the incubators and innovators of true innovation. And we're not only responding to constituent complaints and implementing programs and the nuts and bolts of it every day, but I think we're also in a position with some support, with the right kind of policy, with the right kind of resources to be a real change agent and to take a leadership role. And I think the more we work together, the more that you help us build our capacity to transform ideas into meaningful proposals and sustainable projects. I think that all of the cities in the state of California can prove to be leaders to show cities, states, and countries around the world how to manage this disruption. The other theme I wanted to pick up on was this idea of convergence, where Tony was explaining that one of the reasons why we saw this explosive adoption of the smartphone was because it brought together so many functions into the same little device, functions that people didn't imagine. And I want to draw a lesson from that in terms of policy and programming, and my very division where we've brought together parking and mobility. Because what we're talking about is taking an existing program and managing it effectively, respecting all of the institutions and individuals that are dependent on the status quo, and help them move towards a transportation as a service, as a mobility focus rather than a parking focus, from an automobile-centered transportation system to a person-centered transportation system. And if I hadn't had the opportunity to bring those two things together, my hands would literally be tied. So when I go into community meetings, or I'm talking to business improvement districts, or I'm sitting down with elected officials, it is so empowering to be able to talk about both of those things in the same breath. And if I didn't have both of those within my area of responsibility, I would be at a loss. So think of how we've sort of siloed ourselves. I had the pleasure of attending a workshop at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. Molly's here, she was there a couple months ago. And that was brought together by the U.S. Department of Transportation and the U.S. Department of Energy, Transportation and Energy. And we need to work together across what are historically siloed institutions and recognize the shared challenges, the shared opportunities, and think in terms of progressive policies along those lines. And I think with that, I'll stop.
All right, great. Well, thank you guys for both great presentations. So I'll turn it over to questions unless I get, I don't know, does the moderator get to ask the first question? Because I have one. But, oh, no, I'll let the commissioner. I defer. Commissioner Gilmedi.
Eric, your company's business model is to sell electricity, as well as the other utility companies in the state of California. I'm perplexed that since we're going more and more to electric vehicles, why your company and others really haven't taken Chevron out of the business and put up more charging stations and sell electricity to the average guy on the street?
I think the easiest answer is inertia. So we are giant organizations. We are very risk averse. And so I was involved in the process in 2013, analyzing electric vehicles and saying, is this even good load for the utility customers? Does this increase rates? Does it put downward pressure on rates? And so that discussion really needed to be hammered out first. And that led to our light duty filing and then eventually to our heavy duty filing. But it's really a balance of being stewards of the customer's dollar, and then also with a focus on rates and the impacts on the customers, in addition to those GHG, those local air quality goals. And so the balance is, how much money can we spend on infrastructure prudently, and what is the associated load with that that is not going to have a significant impact on customers as a whole and rates as a whole. And so it's just been a slow process coming through, but we've now, I think, turned a corner. I think SB 350 was very helpful in pushing that. But I think it's just that it kind of takes time. The regulatory process also is lengthy, and so.
I think you and PG&E are way behind the curve on this. There are a whole bunch of gas stations that are shutting down. You could go in and buy those old stations and put charging stations in their place.
There will be much more charging.
Yeah, absolutely. So the PUC for PG&E, San Diego, and SCE has approved charging stations for light duty charging. So this really kicked off our entrance into the charging station market. They were approved as pilots, so they're different lengths for each one of the utilities. SCE's is 1 year. We're going to be doing over 1,000 charging stations. We've already begun installing those. With this new proposal, we're focused on getting charging stations into residences. We're also focused on DC fast charging stations, which is a completely different model from sort of workplace or destination center type of charging. But we are moving forward, and we are installing this infrastructure, and we do have plans to continue to do that, and this is going to be a role, or SCE views this as a role going forward for the utility.
I didn't actually have a question, but as the PUC's sole representative in the room, I thought I'd tag on a little bit, and that's that there's also this debate that's been going on over the last few years as to, should the utilities own the charging structure infrastructure, or should it be owned by a private provider, the likes of ChargePoint? And so traditionally the state has kind of been more towards the latter, and now the state is exploring, what is the kind of sharing possibility that we can do here. But as the gentleman from Edison emphasized, this charging infrastructure is incredibly expensive. And so even the pilot programs that we're adopting right now are hundreds of millions of dollars. And so that's just a portion of the need that will eventually be there down the line. So we have to be very, very cautious moving forward, because we don't want rate increases to be dramatic, and we don't want people to be scared off and attribute the change in the economy, the renewable energy uptake, the change of our power portfolio to be associated with dramatic cost rises that then turns them off of that project altogether. So we just want to be cautious.
Michael, I think it sounds very smart to see a city that is starting to put the parking and the mobility together, and I hadn't really thought about that, but it sounds really smart in terms of local policies, because I can imagine on the revenue side, any city is going to balk at the loss of parking revenue, in your case, 55 million. So I guess I'd like to push you a little bit to describe what is Oakland going to do to kind of make that conversation more productive. Like, what are you going to be doing to help the city figure out how do you offset that loss of revenue through the mobility side and manage the budgets?
The immediate need is to recognize the true cost of the current parking system, because the fact of the matter is Oakland and other cities have historically subsidized private vehicle ownership and has encouraged single occupancy vehicle miles by undercharging and not representing the true costs of maintaining the parking supply. So in Oakland, for example, we've had a one-size-fits-all for on-street parking. So meters, regardless of where you're at in the city of Oakland, it's always $2 an hour. And that needs to change. So we need to actively manage the parking supply rather than just simply assume that one size fits all. And then there's also the challenge that we have where we can no longer pretend like the city-owned assets and our public parking facilities are somehow apart from privately owned parking facilities. The kind of convergence that's happening is going to require a comprehensive parking ecosystem that's working seamlessly. The city of Sacramento, as I'm sure some of you are aware, is actually leading the way in this regard. Folks from the city of Oakland were invited to come to Sacramento about 2 months ago and learn from the city of Sacramento's Sac Park program, which is a model. And they basically see themselves now as a parking broker that's attempting to manage not only its own city-owned parking supply, but the larger privately owned parking supply in even other municipalities. So that convergence is key. And then also recognizing that the cost, unlike the costs in transportation as a service, which are coming down, the costs of parking and parking structures is going up. So when I started at the city of Oakland 4.5 years ago, the numbers that were being thrown around for a built off-street parking facility were between $30,000 and $40,000 per space. Today, the numbers are between $80,000 and $115,000 per space. Okay? So this is the economics of the situation, and it's those very economics that I think are getting the attention of the developers. They're getting the attention of the elected officials. When we go to the community, people, their eyes, open up. And I'm again coming back to that parking and mobility. We have a large construction project where residents are really upset where they're losing their parking and there's more demand for fewer spaces. And the room is full of people who own vehicles. And so one of the things I have to do is I have to remind them that 50%, actually 54% of the folks who live in downtown Oakland don't own a car. So if I was to take the 15 people in the room as representative of the needs of the community, that would be a misrepresentation. And it's bringing that kind of data, the demographics, the economics to bear, and to help make the case that we have to use the parking revenue now to accelerate the development of these cleaner, more equitable, and hopefully economically sustainable programs. So I hope that begins to answer.
Yeah, that's helpful. I don't think about the operational side of work where you have revenue you're generating from people paying on the spot, but you're highlighting that there's a capital investment side too, that the city makes investments, for a parking garage that you've got to recoup. So if you can connect the capital and the operating in terms of decisions at the city level, I can see how that's going to accelerate it. But ultimately, if you're talking about the 2030 and beyond scope, you've got to be talking about transformational redesign on parking, where you may have the autonomous electric vehicles that are using parking garages for charging, and that the whole asset is being used differently. So the taxation and the revenue has to be rethought.
Yeah, just to build on that, one of my original roles was the off-street parking manager, but along the way, I became what I called the off-site parking manager, where developers were looking to meet the city's off-street parking requirements by identifying a parking supply that wasn't on the site. And that leads to the idea that you can unbundle the parking and that you can actually create shared parking facilities. I can sell parking licenses to the developers and still maintain control of the facilities. So for example, during the day, it's serving the needs of the commuters who are working in a tower, but at night, I can actually have other vehicles go in, perhaps a fleet of autonomous electric vehicles, perhaps vehicles that are used by residents who don't want to have to park their cars on the street, and I have sort of an AM/PM model. That all requires an openness to public-private partnerships. I wore this shirt intentionally today, not only because it has my name on it, my last name is Ford, but because the Bay Area's new bike share program is run by a private corporation called Motivate, and it has a corporate sponsor, which happens to be one of the oldest original equipment manufacturers of automobiles in the country, Ford Motor Company. And so it's an openness to new kinds of collaboration, whether it's locally, regionally, or nationally.
So I want to build a little bit on that. And Michael, I think your new department really is parking, mobility, and technology, because it seems to me a lot of what you're doing is trying to take the wonders of this world we live in, and whether it's going to be hot parking pricing, you know, we talk about hot lanes on the highway side. But going back to the question about your city charter includes your port and your parking, so they're used to that revenue stream coming in. And you talked about managing the status quo versus new opportunities and new ways of living. So how do we get so that we don't disincentivize? Because somebody's going to be looking to make up that money that you might decide to allocate differently. So how do we keep, some of the reading materials we had, if you looked at the percentage taxes that were going on to some of these different mobility options, they were off the chart. So how are you managing that? I guess it's within your city folks who love you, but they're used to spending that money.
Yeah, no question about it. So the fact is that parking has been generating a contribution that has been diverted to pay for other essential services like public safety, and we are now dependent on that. And so we have to be mindful of that, and we have to come up with policy and revenue alternatives. One, I think, good example within my operation itself is we want to become even better at parking enforcement and ensure compliance so that we're not being punitive. And in doing that, we're using new technologies, we're doing better education, better training, and as a result, I fully expect the citation revenue to go down. As a result, because there'll be more compliance. I think that Tony might have an idea of when all of the vehicles are autonomous, nobody's making a mistake. It's like RegTech, right? It's regulated technology baked right into the car. So right now, the other shared mobility service that we just introduced a couple months ago is a free floating car share that was introduced by AAA. It's called Gig Car Share. This is a one-way program where you don't have to bring it back. Yeah, Gig, which stands for get in and go. I'll show you the t-shirt in a minute. But there you go. Yeah, so you talk about technology. Right now, the Gig vehicles are being ticketed to the tune of thousands of dollars a month because of street sweeping violations. But now they're working on the technology so that at some point the members will be prompted, don't park here because we know that it's signed street sweeping. So you could be liable for that citation. And also we talk about maybe integrating into the app a crowdsourcing function where if the car happens to be there, they could actually send out a note to their local members and say, hey, you get a $5 credit if you wouldn't mind moving the car to the other side of the street. So pretty soon, all of the citation revenues will start to go down, but in return, we believe that we'll see an uptick in meter revenue. Because now people are actually paying the meters. And so you lose on one hand, right, the real value of the meter will go up. So you lose it on one end, but you'll gain on another. And I think that general pattern is going to hold across modes. And we're only beginning to scratch the surface of how to do it, and it's going to take time. And just again, think of all of the administrative work that went on the back end of going from all those horses to all those cars. I can't imagine, and we have to imagine. That's what we've got to do right now.
And staying on the revenue a little bit, one of the things you just mentioned was public safety. Is your police department looking at what's the loss of revenue without the moving violations?
I hope so. Because now that parking enforcement is in the Department of Transportation, we're going to look very closely at the non-moving citations, and also I think while we're talking about this too, it's really important to emphasize the equity piece in all of this. One of the pieces of one of the materials I asked to be included in your packet today with links was the City of Oakland's new strategic plan. And it's actually being seen as a model around the country, because it's one of the first cases where a city used its values or its goals, such as equity and safety and transparent, responsible government, to drive all of its goals and benchmarks. So I encourage you to take a look at it if you haven't already, because it really speaks to what our values are and what we see ourselves doing day in and day out.
This question is for both of you, and I think the crux of it is kind of how, in Tony's presentation kind of shows you this end state that could potentially, a lot of the interim technologies would be obsolete. So in SCE's case, you're talking about fast charging, you're talking about how, cracking the nut of getting charging into multifamily housing. Well, in that scenario, they're all going to be owned by fleets. This is all a useless exercise. So, and in the case of the City of Oakland, Smart Park is expensive. It takes 4 or 5 years to roll out a hardware-based system that may be obsolete in 3 years. But how do you juggle not wanting the perfect to be the enemy of the good? I mean, you had the other comment about why are you so late to do one thing, and now we have a comment about, well, it may be obsolete. So how do you find your organization struggling with that?
It's definitely something that we struggle on, and I think the shortfall that we currently have with EV charging outside of residences is significant. And the forecasts from NREL, from state regulatory organizations, agencies, are saying that we're going to need millions of charging stations. Now, this doesn't take into account the type of disruptive material that Tony was speaking on. But I think anything that we're doing in the near term being the next 5 years, the next 7 years, we're probably not going to be able to achieve those levels. The deployment need is just so high. And so the infrastructure that we're going to be installing is not going to be a waste. It's not like we're going to be overbuilding, expecting 7 million electric vehicles, and so we want this electric infrastructure to be there. We're really chasing that vehicle sales market. And so I think when it comes to obsolescence, it's really looking at making sure that we install infrastructure that is upgradable, and that's not super costly to be upgraded. So I'm thinking specifically about DC fast charging. If we put in infrastructure and lay pipe that only allows for a 50 kilowatt charger, and in the future all those vehicles are going to 200 kilowatts, we want to make sure that we can replace that infrastructure and not have to rip everything out and completely upgrade. And so I think that's like one of the way we can look at the obsolescence, really looking at the infrastructure. And the other one is going to be location. Nobody knows what the model is going to look like. Is it all residential charging with occasional, gas station model DC fast charging? Is it all workplace charging? What is the mix of that? And we simply don't know. And I think right now we're significantly far behind on the infrastructure point, that anything that we can be doing in the next 5 years is going to be beneficial. And
can you comment on, that's very on topic, do those projections from the laboratories and all for the charging demand, are they factoring in how much battery technology is improving? We're going to have much longer range batteries. I agree that the demand for charging places will go up. There's not enough in the public sphere now. But I wonder if it's going to go up as much as they say. And also, what about beyond level 2 and DC fast chargers, the kind of superchargers, and where should they go?
Yeah, so I think there's actually a lot in that question. One of the things is with the increases in battery technology, no matter how many miles I can get on my EV, my work is still the same distance from my home. And so the miles that I drive are probably not going to change. However, if I have a lot more range, my charging pattern may change. And I think that that's one of the challenges as we think about going beyond the pilots that the utilities have already begun, and what does this model look like, and really hedging our bets on that. I think specifically your question on those forecasts, they do incorporate a switchover in the types of vehicles that are being sold and that are being utilized. Again, how accurate those are, I guarantee all of the forecasts will be wrong. And then your second question on where DC fast charging specifically should be located, and I think you can look at right now along corridors is going to be really, really important. But the way electric vehicle rates are structured, I think we do have some insight that single-family residences, it will be very beneficial for them to charge their vehicle, assuming that they own a vehicle and they're not using this TAS, overnight. When your car is sitting, you have very low electricity rates. The economic benefit of that is going to be so much cheaper than going to a DC fast charging and having to pay for that really fast power and that fast charge. However, for street parkers, people that live in apartment buildings that can't necessarily put a charging station into their apartment building, charging at the workplace or relying solely on DC fast charging will be the model. And I would assume that you would see those popping up in more of a gas station model, so where gas stations are located within those communities, but it would be more focused on more densely populated areas than single-family residential communities.
Eric, if I could just add to that, I think you're spot on, but as somebody that I've been driving an electric car now for 4.5 years, one of my sons at 3 years, you've got to do both. You've got to have, for me, nothing beats leaving the house every day with a full tank of juice. And like you said, I'm charging at midnight using time of use rates. It's cheap. But at the same time, though, and it works most of the time, but for me, if I'm going San Diego to LA, I'll use a supercharger. Those things need to be located, DC fast included, at places where it's convenient for the public. Shopping, coffee shops, places to eat. So while they're plugged in and charging, they get the juice. My son, who lives in an apartment, he doesn't have a charger where he lives, so he goes to DC fast charger at a mall, and he'll just sit in the car and he'll do his email or what have you. But I think you need both. I understand as we change to a task model, things will be different, but right now there isn't simply enough infrastructure. So laws should be established that mandate infrastructure in all new homes. That goes without saying, and I know many jurisdictions have done that. But when it comes to the public infrastructure, you're exactly on. We shouldn't be shortchanging the idea that it's always going to be these lousy little level 2 chargers, which those things are only good if you're going to be there for 6, 7, 8 hours. And there's only so many of them. And they cost today a lot less to install than DC fast, but that will change. So I would agree with you on that. The last point was just relative to other technologies going forward. While battery technology improves, one thing, and you guys from Edison ought to look into this in the LA market, is partnering, and that's where the Transportation Commission and others would come in, is in-road vehicle charging is something where on the HOV lanes you might have a 5-mile stretch where somebody through an account process could pick up a range boost of 10 to 20% just driving on a 5-mile stretch. And I think those are things we should also be thinking about, and I think that ties back to some of the efforts of this forum and what CTC would be looking at.
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of opportunities, specifically when you're talking about the in-road charging. I think that in-road charging or some type of like overhead catenary wire when you're en route is a lot more applicable towards the freight sector, because you will have special lanes, you know that those trucks are going to be there, they run those routes, versus an in-route charging for light duty vehicles where some. Right. There'll be autonomous tomorrow, but it's like, but there are several factors. The vehicles have to be able to take it. The infrastructure has to be there. A pricing mechanism has to be laid out. And all this stuff, it's very challenging. Those partnerships are going to be key, and I think there are a lot of solutions. When you were talking about DC fast charging, that it needs to be there, I think the future is going to have different models for fueling specifically related to DC fast charging. Just like we have different grades of gasoline, I think you can have located at a shopping center, you can pay a certain amount and you get 50 kW and you charge in 45 minutes. Or if you want to pay a little bit more, you can charge at 200 kW, you're out of there in 4.5. So I think that you'll see a suite of a lot of different solutions. I think there's going to be a lot of businesses that are going to come in and try to make inroads in this market and have different selections for customers to choose from.
Hey, Doug, do we have any online questions? Okay.
I just had a quick follow-up question for Eric, and that's that, you mentioned home-based charging for EVs, and right now, people are incentivized to do that in the middle of the night because it is off-peak, super off-peak. There's just not that much load being served. But if we suddenly have millions upon millions upon millions of these vehicles, could, there no longer be an off-peak or a super off-peak, and suddenly we kind of have a more balanced amount of load across the entirety of the day, including the middle of the night, due to the need to charge these vehicles? And if that's the case, where's the renewable procurement coming from in the future to accommodate that load demand?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the fantastic attributes of these vehicles is that they're flexible load sources. So if I send a price signal to someone and it's no longer attractive for them to charge in the evening, or it's more attractive for them to charge in the middle of the day when we have overgen, you can easily shift that load just by purely economic signals. And so if we could get all of these vehicles filling up those drops in the daily load shape and flatten our load shape, that would be hugely beneficial, especially when it comes to rates, especially when it comes to scheduling and servicing and deploying generation in order to service these vehicles.
Do we have any more questions? Oh, Mr. Siva. Hold on, Tony. Use the mic.
I have one comment since you talked about trucking. Actually, trucking is probably short haul. It's going to be disrupted even sooner than cars. Yeah, you're nodding. You get it. And it doesn't even need autonomy, right? I mean, it's going to happen just because of electric trucks, and we're on the cusp of that. Essentially, electric trucks are almost the same sticker price as diesel trucks. And of course, they're 90% cheaper to fuel and maintain and so on. So you're soon, meaning within the next year, going to start seeing the FedExes and the UPSs of the world transition very quickly to EVs, electric trucks for short haul. And it's going to happen very quickly because, Say that again? Well, short haul truck is 100 miles.
I think it's like a medium duty truck. Well, like your UPS, your Pepsi Cola.
Yeah. So 71% of all trucking in the U.S. is 250 miles or less. So all trucking. And so, we're already there in terms of technology. It's just a matter of the battery prices to come down at that 250-mile level. So we're going to see a massive disruption for both light duty and heavy trucking over the next few years. I mean, I already know companies that are about to announce their trucks that are basically as cheap or cheaper than a diesel truck to buy, and they're actually going to be as a service. Just like Netflix. Essentially, they're not going to sell you the truck, but they're going to sell you the miles. And they're going to build their own stations, charging stations, think fleets. And, at least one of them told me that they're even going to build their own solar power to charge them. So, I mean, these are massive disruptions, and trucking is one of them that may happen even sooner than cars. Because, once a large company makes the transition, it would be, they're not going to have half their fleet typewriters and half their fleet as computers, right? They're going to transition very quickly. So that's just one comment.
Thank you, Tony. So I appreciate the time. I want to, want to give the speakers a little bit of opportunity to just do a quick close, but before that, I would like to close myself. I would like to suggest, I appreciate the conversation. I really appreciate the input that we've got thus far from all of our speakers, and the vision that we may very well see in the next 13 years that I think Tony laid out so well. But I think that one of the things that makes that not true right now is that it's against the law. And that's one of the reasons why we think that this is an important conversation to be bringing to legislative staff right now, is that all of this vision, all of these wonderful things that may or may not happen, a lot of them can't happen right now because of regulations and laws, frankly. And that's tangled, and that's difficult, and that's some stuff that we, as ledge staff, will need to think about going forward. So, hopefully I've pitched up a closing discussion for these two guys to give a quick 1 minute or 2 minute where they can let our audience know, some of the things that we need to think about in order to make some of these things happen, because solutions are great, except that government is slow. And so, we need to try to help figure out how to do that in the best way possible. So go ahead, Michael.
Great. So 2 closing thoughts. The first one, Oakland and our mayor, Libby Schaaf, repeatedly comes back to this statistic. Oakland is a city of stark contrasts and inequality. A resident in my neighborhood, which is Grand Lake neighborhood, has a life expectancy of 85 years. Just less than a mile and a half away in East Oakland, the life expectancy is 68. Okay, so that's a 17-year swing, and it's just a mile or 2 away. And what we need to recognize here is that the technology, the transportation technology and policy of the past is partially responsible for those community impacts. Okay, and what we need to do is make sure as we go forward and we pave the way and accelerate the coming of these new disruptive technologies, that we're not perpetuating or reproducing these inequalities and inequities. And the second thing is we've heard a lot, especially Tony gave some great information about the lowering costs of transportation as a service. But my challenge to everybody in the room is, just because we have lower costs doesn't translate into lower prices and rates. Okay, and that's not a question of technology in the sense of hard drives and CPUs. That's a question of social technology and policy. So I hope that as we think about the impacts on our local communities, that we keep that in mind and try to answer that question too.
Great, and I would absolutely like to echo that. I think that the communities are going to be the ones that are going to be at the forefront of this disruption, of deploying the technology, of making sure that it gets in the hands of everybody across socioeconomic statuses, and the role of partnerships with large organizations, with smaller organizations, and community, environmental and community groups is going to be essential. But it's really going to happen at the community level before it happens at these larger, grander regional levels, I think. And then another comment is speed. So really address that this is coming, it's going to happen really fast. How are we setting up our policies, our regulatory processes, and balancing that accountability and that push with the speed that the market is going to drive these markets towards, whether it's electrification or automation or other types of services.
Great, so let's give our speakers a hand. And next up, I'll turn it over to Christina Suri with the Commission, and she's going to introduce the next panels. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So we're doing some changes up here. I've got 3 panel members that we're going to invite shortly up. I have the distinct pleasure of doing 2 things this morning. The first is to moderate the panel on supporting technology innovations. The second is it's the panel before lunch. So we're going to ask our our panel members to quickly come up. I know there's some changing in the seats back there. So I'd ask Quinn Garcia, Dr. Arvan Kalas, and Executive Director Randy Iwasaki to come up. And so sticking to the theme of, obviously, disruptive technology, I think we've all talked about the thing that disrupts the way we do business and the way that we live. And in order for it to be relevant, it has to transcend, it has to be long-lasting. Those are the two things that are pervasive when we think about disruptive technology. Part of what we were talking about, and I think the last panel kind of briefly touched on it, was you need change agents to be able to sustain disruptive technology. So I have the honor of presenting 3 of those change agents, and part of the brilliance of putting these 3 folks together was they really embody 3 different aspects of the disruptive technology that we want to bring to the ledge staffers that are here. The first is the public sector implementers, and that's with Randy. He's going to cover that perspective. The second is the actual innovators, and Arvin is going to cover that. And then we've got the investors in those technologies, and that's what Quinn's going to address. So no further ado, I've asked Arvin to start the trend, and I'm just going to get out of the way and let them do what they do best.
Thank you, and thank you all for having us over here. Thank you for staging this panel. It's a great honor to be here. Should I start? Okay, so, I'm employed by the Volvo Group, and this is my best shot at increasing our sales. So I'm going to give a sales pitch. If you go to the next, well, I got the clicker. All right. So the Volvo Group is a leading manufacturer of buses, construction equipment, and most importantly, trucks. I also put industrial-grade marine engines. But here's how our product lineup looks like. About 65% of our revenue comes from selling trucks. We sell a variety of trucks. We build our Volvo trucks in North America. Mack Trucks is part of the Volvo Group, and then there's some other international brands. About 20% comes from selling construction equipment, 10% from selling buses, and the remainder comes from selling industrial-grade marine engines. At the Volvo Group, we believe and we understand that 3 trends, connectivity, autonomous vehicles or automated driving functionalities, and electromobility are going to be the 3 pillars that will drive the smart city revolution. In this talk, I'm going to focus just on connectivity and automated driving. So if you recall the wonderful spiel given by the first panel, it was focused on electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, and I'd like to think of connectivity being an umbrella that'll fully tap into the potential of these disruptive technologies. With this in mind, the Volvo Group has been investing in a variety of R&D projects, a lot of which have been generously funded by the US DOT, and a lot of other projects have been funded by the entities in California. I'm going to talk a little bit about the automated driving projects. What you see is a photo from a truck platooning demonstration in LA. This happened early this year. So you see those 3 Volvo trucks driving as a truck platoon on I-110. This was done in collaboration with University of California, Berkeley, funded by Caltrans and Federal Highway. We had LA Metro as another partner. The main point of this demo was to bring in visitors right in the trucks and get a feel for what it is to sit in an automated following scenario. I saw Fran Inman, she's probably stepped out, but she was one of the persons who was there also. I wish she's here. She can talk to that. Let's see. The same project, we took the trucks to Canada. And on a controlled test track, we tried to quantify the fuel savings that are possible from this truck platooning technology. So 2 things were accomplished. The first step, we did it in LA and we showed that it's safe. People who sat in the trucks understood the safety implications of automated following. And then in Canada, we tried to quantify the fuel savings benefits. Last year, across the Atlantic in Europe, my colleagues participated in a European truck platooning challenge. Now, the technology viability aside, the most important lesson there was to realize the handshaking that is needed between the public agencies. So the trucks drove from Sweden all the way to the Netherlands. So you're crossing 5 international borders, so you can think of the policy and the public agency interactions that are needed to have this caravan go along the seamless platooning corridor. Another form of automated driving, a concept truck, was introduced in Brazil. And this is where, so in the first 3 examples, you have the brake throttle maneuvers that are automated, level 1 automated driving. This one that you see is still level 1 automated, but over here, the steering is automated. So this is for an agricultural setting, and it's a concept truck also. So in all 4 examples that I just briefly mentioned, the driver's still in the cab, 1 maneuver is automated. Now moving to the other end of the spectrum, where you don't have the driver, you take out the driver. So this is the world's first autonomous mining truck that was introduced last year. Still a concept truck, but when you really think about it, you're driving in very hazardous situations. Paying for driver insurance and protecting human life is very, very expensive, very important. You take out the driver, you send a truck that can be replaced, the truck sort of navigates itself autonomously. I think it's a win-win for everybody. Early this year, maybe around summer, the early part of summer, we showed an autonomous refuse truck. Very different setting, but if you really think about the path of this refuse truck, especially in European cities, it's point A to point B, point A to point B, and it's very repetitive. And so, again, there's a lot of costs associated with worker compensation and injuries associated with garbage collection. And so here's where we see the value benefit. I said connectivity and automated driving. So the Volvo Group recognizes the importance of connectivity, and what you see are some screenshots or photos from a connected vehicle infrastructure demonstration involving 9 other automotive OEMs, of which we were a part. I'm going to show a couple of videos, and that'll sort of be a good relief from my monologue. But really, the takeaway is I've shown you a variety of technological options in the connectivity and automated driving arena. And there is no silver bullet. The real choice of that technology is going to be dictated by the business segment and really what is it doing to solve the problem. So with that, I'm going to request clicking on the first video. There's still one more slide after this. But what you see over here is, you're sitting in the truck and you're approaching a construction zone, very clear by the orange cones. You just don't know what's happening with the lane closures, correct? So if you kind of look at the screen monitor here, it's a prototype implementation. As soon as you see that sign over there, the road closure sign or the lane closure sign, you're going to get a notification on your screen saying you are on a lane, you're approaching a work zone, and the lane that you're on is going to close. And that's where you see the red flashing. And as soon as you sort of do the right thing and get off that lane that is about to close, the warning disappears. Now, I'm not saying this is the best way to show this information to the vehicle operator who is still in control of the truck, but this is an option. This was a prototype where real-time communication between the infrastructure and the truck saved the day. I could understand that the lane that I'm on is going to close, and I could take the appropriate action to avoid collision. Now, the second video is actually from a demonstration on 580. If you slide over to 425, please. Yeah, 4 minutes and 25 seconds, please. What you're seeing here is 3 Volvo tractors, it's bobtail, and you're driving on the road, and you're going to see a cut-in. So a car cuts in between the second and the third truck, and you can see the third truck sort of back off. The key thing here is the driver's still in charge, but this maneuver is automated. The brake and throttle maneuvers are automated. And then once the cut-in vehicle exits, you're going to see the gap between the second and the third truck close, and this again happens autonomously. If you slide to 525, please. You'll see another instance of this, basically the cut-in between the first and the second truck. So you see the two trucks, the third truck's actually behind us, and you'll see the car cut in between the first and the second truck, and you will see that the second truck slows down. This happens autonomously, automatically. The driver doesn't do anything. That's the part, that's the functionality that is automated here. All right, thank you. And we'll go back to the PowerPoint slide and the last slide. Oops. Yeah, if you just click on that. Okay, well, thank you. Well, so you see all these technologies and you know there's no clear solution. Maybe all of these are going to be part of an ecosystem that is emerging as we speak, right? But what are some of the things that we should be thinking about to make this a reality? So, for example, and this is just a select list of issues pertaining to vehicular connectivity and automated driving, and I'm sure my panelists will also bring some other things to your attention. So the NHTSA V2V rule is under progress, and this is for light-duty vehicles. We don't have one for the heavy-duty vehicles. But what do the California infrastructure owner-operators and public agencies think about this? Do we have a position in the state? Well, it's not about demonstrations anymore. You know, the technology is clearly there. Technology viability has been demonstrated many times. There's still work to be done, but it's going on. So let's start thinking about the business cases. We have a connectivity or a connected vehicle test bed in Palo Alto. What are we doing with it? How are we going to extend it? If there's other connected vehicle deployments in the state of California, how are we going to sponsor this? How are we going to harmonize this? What are the steps that the California public agencies need to take? So last year, well, a couple years ago when we started the truck platooning project, we had two Senate bills, SB 431 and SB 719, which actually allowed a Caltrans funded project, a 3-truck platoon, to drive closer than 100 feet. Now, that bill is about to expire. There is a clause for which, you know, Peloton, Volvo Group, and other technology providers have actually submitted an extension request. What are we doing with it? Should we not recognize this more? What are the steps being taken to promote the testing of platooning, especially when it comes to trucks? So I know I'm not going to steal Randy's buzz, but there's 2 US DOT designated autonomous vehicle proving grounds, first of which, you know, is headed by Randy. But there's one in San Diego. What are we doing with it? Obviously, it is the right place to develop and build and foster an ecosystem of connected and autonomous vehicles. Again, it's ecosystem. What are we doing with it? How are we bringing people? And lastly, another teaser here is, you know, I was at the Automated Vehicle Symposium and I was blown away by the amount of energy and focus that is happening, you know, in different parts of the world. Even within the states, I found out that a lot of states are taking bolder measures, including the FMCSA at the Fed level, to recognize and plan for testing and you know, even bringing these to the market. What are we doing? You know, for example, there's a provision for light-duty vehicles, but that really exempts testing of autonomous trucks, driverless trucks on California roads. What are the steps we need to take to advise and maybe strategically develop guidelines for bringing these into the testing phase and eventually into safe products on the road? So with these thoughts, I'm going to stop talking and hand it over to Randy.
Thank you. It's great to be back in Sacramento. I was sneezing earlier. I thought I had allergies of coming to Sacramento, but I guess it quit, so I'm probably not allergic to Sacramento. I am going to give you a briefing on what we call Redefining Mobility City 5.0. I won't get into the details, but talk to you more about testing and regulations. So we're a sales tax authority. I work for one of the 24 counties in California that use sales tax to fund transportation. We're a 20-person organization. We manage a multi-billion-dollar portfolio of projects and programs. We contract out 95% of our work. We're AA+ rated on Wall Street, both by Fitch and by Standard & Poor's. And the reason why that's important is we bond against future revenue, bring 42.5% forward, and we build infrastructure. So we have a 25-year and 10 program. So we do everything we can, and Tim Hale is in back. He's our new Deputy Executive Director for projects, and his responsibility is to deliver these projects very, very quickly. And I'll talk about our changes that we need in the planning process. These are some things that we do. You know who we are, so I'm not going to belabor all these issues. So transportation planning, regulation reform. We plan, there was a study that was done, and I have details on that, but we've broken our county up into 4 separate subregions. We're a little bit different along Interstate 80. It's more built out versus West County, which is still building infrastructure. They're building homes out there. So it's different needs for different parts of Contra Costa County. And so what we're doing is we're in the process now of updating our countywide transportation plan, but we're changing the way we model the future. And so there was a study done by the National League of Cities, and we'll show you the results of that. But we're changing the way we gather information. We're using technology. We're using social media. We're using our Facebook page. We're giving you an allocation of Contra Costa coins. We're inverting a telephone town hall. This cycle, using technology, we got more comments from the public this one cycle than the previous 25 years combined. And so Sandag actually borrowed our process of inverting a telephone town hall, and they enjoyed the same results. We're getting better information. Our public says that we have some issues that we need to fix. Potholes, for one. Those gosh darn red lights, when they're red on you and there's nobody else around, why is it red? And there's technology available today that could solve that problem. They want a better BART, but they also want a first and last mile solution. So a lot of people, we assume everybody owns a car in California. Not everybody owns a car. Some people are getting old like me. We can't walk as far as fast as we used to. By the time we get up, because we're waking up later and later, we get to BART, there's no parking, so you have to drive. So we're trying to fix that first and last mile. That's what we learned in our planning efforts. And so we're changing the way we model, and I'm getting accused now of giving a number of future capacity of a freeway lane. So I won't tell you what our prediction is, but it's higher than 2,000 vehicles per lane per hour. And some guy, professor from Purdue, I was in Toronto yesterday, and he waved at me. He says, "There's the number guy." So he said the number, and so he's making fun of it. But I think I'm closer than 2,000 vehicles per lane per hour. We're also modeling the future using zero-emission fleet turnover. So this is the study, National League of Cities, the 50 largest metropolitan area in the 50 states, plus 18 more. They looked at their long-range plans. 3% considered the effects of Lyft and Uber in their cities, even though 60 to 68 a couple years ago, Lyft and Uber were operating. So you have to change the way you plan. You may need different projects in the future. 6% of those plans even mention autonomous vehicles and their impacts. And so this technology will be here because our plans are 25, 30 years long. And so what we do at the Contra Costa Transportation Authority is we try to predict the future using future models to make sure we're making the right investments, because a lot of times we say we don't have enough money for transportation. So what we're trying to do is make sure we invest in the right projects, not only today, but tomorrow as well. Climate change, 58% zero-emission fleet turnover and a slight reduction in VMT per capita, because I'm always accused of not caring about VMT, but I do. So we're trying to reduce per capita, a slight change. We can get, by 2040, if we get a 58% fleet turnover based on our models, by the year 2050, we'll meet an 80% reduction in greenhouse gases. So Momentum Station, thank you for mentioning we were one of the two. San Diego region is the other one. We're global, so we're trying to make sure that we partner with everybody that wants to partner with us, so we share data, so you don't have to test the things that we're testing. So I gave a speech at AVS. I said, for example, Michigan, it snows 10 months out of the year, so it's always snow covered, and so they can only test snow and ice for 10. And in Contra Costa County, it never snows and it never freezes, and so generally. And so we're testing the other aspects of testing. But we have an agreement with Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, China. We just signed an agreement with Japan. We just signed a 4-country agreement. New Zealand, the country of New Zealand, the country of Australia, the country of Singapore, and the country of Contra Costa. We set this up. Number one reason why we set a test bed up was because one of our board members came to me after a board meeting and said, "You need to find a way of creating smart jobs at the Naval Weapons Station." I'd never even heard of the Naval Weapons Station, to be honest. And I went out there and I said, "My God, this is a great place to test vehicles." Efficient mobility. If cars refuse to crash, your system is going to get more efficient, so you're going to get a number like 3,300 vehicles per lane per hour in the future. Enhanced safety. Cars refuse to crash, and that's our top priority. Anybody in the transportation business, your first priority is safety. If we can reduce those 38,000 deaths, I mean, we're doing something for society. And then healthier environment. We're bullish on the electric motor. There was a discussion on hydrogen versus battery. We like the battery, but ultimately zero-emission vehicles are the way to go in the future, not just with the light fleet, but also with the heavy fleet. So the Naval Weapons Station is 5,000 acres. It's about the fifth the size of San Francisco. It's 7 miles long by 1.5 miles wide. That's Bunker City in the foreground on the left. We're testing vehicle-to-infrastructure communication. So another regulation you think about is keeping that DSRC, or the 5.9 gigahertz frequency, for future use for safety messages between vehicles. Because when Peloton or Volvo are talking to each other, they're using DSRC. And you have to be able to send about 2,000 messages uncoded, about 1,400 messages coded through those 6 channels, and making sure that those vehicles actually know it's me talking to you and not some hacker talking to you and it's get all messed up. So that's one regulation reform, or keep it. Those are 1.8 miles long, and they're bisected every now and again between the bunkers with roads. You can modify an intersection to look like a 4-way stop, a two-minor road stop, through on the major 4-legged intersection that's signalized, a T intersection, however you want to frame it, and also can be European, Asian, and American striping patterns. So this is the infrastructure. So if you're building a new facility, you're going to test your autonomous vehicle, that pavement's going to be brand new. There's very few contractors that can put an old road down. Now, sometimes they do, not on purpose, and we have to fix it. But normally they want to put a brand new road and brand new striping. This striping is 45 years old, and that's indicative of the rest of the United States. So not every road is brand new. There's gravel roads in the United States. Skid testing, lower middle, you can test smart parking. So smart parking, we talked about herd parking. So imagine a day, just at a minimum, the cars no longer have to open their doors. And so they go in, and your parking structures that take up prime real estate around your transit facilities, prime real estate in your cities, now become more efficient. And so if you're going to build a new parking facility, you may want to make it retrofittable, make it 15 feet high, 20 feet high to hide the utilities, because you may be retrofitting that one of these days, because generally you build a structure like that to last 75 years. I don't think you're going to need that in 75 years. Tunnels, so you'll lose those are 1,400 foot long, 14-foot diameter tunnels. Twin bores, so you lose signal in the middle. You might want to know how your car reacts when it loses GPS signal. So our partners, Honda Research, first generation AV on the back, the LiDAR is on the top, the beanie. In the foreground, that's the second generation, they're on to their third. They taught these vehicles how to make a human-like left turn and a right turn, because if you've been in a DARPA car, it's very herky-jerky, it makes me seasick. These cars are very human-like, they go around obstacles. Freight, so I've been told that I'm supposed to spend 25% of my time when I'm thinking about ITS on freight, and so I'm doing, oh, Commissioner Inman, I see you right there, thank you. Thank you for that assignment. Auto, so Auto is a Volvo. They got, I think, 6 Volvo trucks, fully autonomous. They delivered 17,452 cases of Budweiser beer in Colorado. Why? Because, once again, that 100-foot spacing was an issue. And so we need to make sure that our laws keep up with the future technological advances. Otherwise, you're going to force those folks to test in another state, and that means jobs going somewhere else. Baidu, we made the announcement today. It's on our website. AI, so they're on their second generation car, artificial intelligence. So how do these vehicles think about how they're going to drive through infrastructure in the future? Easy Mount, we need a special legislation, AB 1592, the only piece of legislation that exempts us from a driver's steering wheel and a brake pedal. That's fully autonomous, level 4. It needs a precision-based map, not a level 5. But it's that first and last mile issue. We're trying to solve that problem. These are our partners, Best Mile, startup company in Europe, route optimization, come get me app. First Transit, if you contract out bus service, that's who will bid on your work. Bay Area Air Quality Management District, they want to clean the air. Bishop Ranch, forward-thinking owner of Bishop Ranch, 600-acre business park. We're testing there right now. Buses come in, drop passengers off at each of their locations. These large buses, they deadhead back. We want them to go back completely full. Bay Area Rapid Transit, BART, they're worried about parking. So they've just delayed, 520 space, $37 million structure. That's about $71,000 space. That's a lot of money. And Stantec's our strategic consultant. Once again, we only have 20 people. This is our phase. We're in phase 2B. We're going to move these vehicles over to an occupied parking lot. This is where we tested on the first phase, second phase. These are large, at-grade parking lots. And so we're going to test it now with interaction between bicycles, pedestrians, and cars. And then we got that bill to try to cross the streets. And so we have authorizations to cross the street at Gomentum Station and at Bishop Ranch. We just don't have an agreement with NHTSA. This fits in a gray area. It's too heavy. The production rate is low enough and the speed is low enough. It's less than 35 miles per hour, but it weighs 6,200 pounds fully loaded. And their exemption process is for 3,000 pounds or less. So we need help in that area. And then Bernard assures me that we're getting a permit as soon as I show him that letter. And the plan is to deploy this to help enhance transit, not to take bus drivers' jobs away, because you're going to need a bus driver driving through that complex as it negotiates through city streets. But this is to get you and your friends to that bus, and then if we get more bus riders, we can run more express bus service in the future. Impacted industries, insurance, it's not a matter of getting insurance, it's the agreements that you have to write. That's very difficult. We have our own lawyer at Momentum Station. The auto parts, the TNCs may change in the future. I think Susan may talk about that. Auto industry may sell less cars. The ownership rules may change. Parking structures, fast foods. That's not ours. That's cbinsights.com. And then we're here today, we engage, we talk about regulation reform, we talk about flexible regulations. We used to leverage a lot. We used to leverage money, at least when I worked for the state. We used to leverage technology. We're still trying to do that at the Contra Costa Transportation Authority, collaboration. We have great partners, and so we're looking for partners, including Volvo. If you want to just come out and test, you can do that too. We can sign an agreement, but there are Volvo trucks out there now. So thank you very much.
Thanks. Mind if I stand?
Of course.
Can I pace around like a madman? So hi everyone, my name is Quinn Garcia. I'm one of the managing directors of Autotech Ventures. We're a VC firm that's based in Menlo Park. We're a new firm. We just raised a $120 million fund just to invest in ground transportation-related startup companies. So I want to share with you a little bit of our views on how the ground transport domain is being disrupted and share a bit of my personal passion for this space. All I want to do with my career is develop transportation tech. And I'm also hoping to learn a bit from all of you, because despite being a son of a California senator and running around here as a little kid, I remain fairly ignorant on transport policy. So would love to hear from you guys and get educated myself. So we're a bunch of transportation executives. And I'm a transportation entrepreneur, and we're a bunch of venture capitalists. And we invest only in ground transportation related startups. So think things with tires, things that, moving people and goods along roads, and all the services related to those things with tires. So nothing that floats or flies or goes on rails, right? And we're essentially a bridge between transportation startups and large corporations, in the sense that startups are really innovative, really fast, frugal, very sharp, but they're terrible at scaling. And they lack existing customer channels, right? Corporations tend to be the inverse of that, right? Corporations tend to have trouble with innovation, but they're phenomenal at scaling and they have access to big customers. So pairing the two together, voila, you have a nimble and scalable way to commercialize new ground transport tech. The markets that we focus on within ground transport, so they're enormous. A couple $1 trillion in the U.S. alone in ground transport, and this is spanning. Vehicle manufacturing gets a lot of the press. The vehicle industry, auto manufacturing business is being disrupted, or truck manufacturing business being disrupted. But if you look at vehicle manufacturing, it's actually a small fraction. It's about a tenth of the overall ground transport sector market size as a whole, and the rest of that is all services. And those industries, those service industries, are being disrupted just as much as the vehicle manufacturing business is. And I think Randy alluded to that with some of the CB Insights data that he shared. So in a world where you have shared vehicles, who's insuring them? And if they don't crash, do you need insurance? So it's impacting the insurance industry. In a world where vehicles are, again, shared, especially in urban centers, who's selling them? Right, all the dealers today they're actually a larger industry than the vehicle manufacturing business. Who's retailing these things, right? In a world with logistics and automated trucking and fleets, right? So those all dramatically change with the advent of a lot of this new transportation tech that startup companies and also a lot of the big tech giants that are in Silicon Valley and elsewhere are developing. So my point here is yes, manufacturing's important. Everyone can relate with a car, but the service industry is much larger, and it's equally disrupted here. So if you think about our scope and also the problems that startups are attacking and trying to solve, think of the most painful ground transport experiences that you've had. Both as a consumer and also on a business level, right? So trying to get parking, trying to hail a cab, getting into a crash, contending with massive traffic, trying to go into a dealership to buy a new car or truck and getting gouged in some cases, trying to sell your used vehicle, whether it be again car, truck, or otherwise. Also, all really painful experiences. Trying to ship something. Right, moving goods, a load of tomatoes from Bakersfield or Fresno to, call it Boston, right? So big, painful experiences, and those are the experiences that sharp entrepreneurs, people smarter than I am, are going out and trying to solve. And they tend to use two advancements in technology to solve these problems. It's basically cheap electronics and ubiquitous wireless connectivity. Right? If you look at pretty much every successful transportation startup, whether it be Lyft, Uber, Waze, Tesla, ChargePoint, and otherwise, they're all enabled by those two technological advancements that just occurred maybe in the past decade or so. So what are we excited about? I'll tell you about some of the companies that we've invested in. That'll give you kind of a feel for where we think this sector is headed and the kind of companies that we're excited about. So Lyft, we invested in. I don't need to tell you guys about Lyft. I think you all are pretty familiar. We invested in them in part because we see that private vehicle ownership, at least in urban centers, is diminishing. In other places that are more rural, it's not going to for a while, but at least in urban centers, it's diminishing pretty rapidly. And whether Lyft is a cause or an effect of that, it's probably some of both. We also invested into a company called Outdoorsy, which is essentially Airbnb for motorhomes, right? So think of that RV that is sitting in your neighbor's yard or driveway or sitting out there on your street. It's sitting there usually for about 50 weeks out of the year as an eyesore. And it's being used for 2 of those weeks. So why the heck are we not sharing these things? Right? And that's what Outdoorsy does, is they have this online marketplace that allows these highly underutilized, highly expensive assets to be shared. And there's this demographic trend of people being less interested to own vehicles and more interested in buying experiences, young and old, right? So people want to go to Burning Man, and they want to go to Bonnaroo, and they want to go to football tailgates, and they want to go to Big Sur, and they want to go campings, right? So there's this demographic trend, and it's also kind of increased utilization of assets. The third company that we invested in is called Realign. And Realign is solving a lot of the challenges related to logistics brokerage, so long-haul trucking. So long-haul trucking industry, I think it's been discussed a bit today, enormous industry, highly fragmented industry, meaning there's thousands of different players in this industry, and historically hasn't really applied IT to solve a lot of the problems. So what Realign is doing is essentially like Slack for logistics, or Facebook for logistics, or WeChat for logistics. It's a set of apps that all the parties to a long-haul trucking shipment can use to communicate with each other in real time related to a long-haul trucking shipment of tomatoes or car parts or lumber or eggs or otherwise, right? So this is actually a bet against Uber for trucks. Uber for trucks is basically, let's disintermediate the logistics brokers entirely with an online marketplace. This company is actually enabling those logistics brokers and all the parties, the shippers and consignees and otherwise, they're enabling them with IT tools to help streamline some of their communications and workflow. The fourth company that we invested in is called Volta. We were talking about ChargePoint a little bit earlier today. Volta is essentially an EV, it's essentially a media company. So it's an outdoor advertising company that is dressed in an EV charging station company's clothing. So what they do is they they install these kiosks in front of retail outlets, so Whole Foods and premium retailers and shopping malls and whatnot. And they get real estate from those folks, and then they give away charging for free to anybody. And then they sell advertising on these big TVs that are built into the kiosk to show ads to all of these shoppers who are walking in and driving in past the charge stations into the retail outlet. So it's a win for the drivers, and they get a free charge. It's a win for the advertisers. They get to have a lot of eyeballs looking at their ad, and it's a win for the retailers in that they get to provide an amenity to shoppers who want to come in and charge. And this is, so I'm a proponent of EVs, but I'm also a realist in that I think it's going to take many years. Maybe California, we're a little bit different than some other states, and we have our own little bubble here, but in many parts of the US, I think that EVs are going to have slower adoption than a lot of us here in California would like to see. And so in that world where you have, let's say, moderate EV adoption, this company is able to thrive and survive because they're not selling electrons, but rather selling eyeballs. The fifth company that we invest in is called DeepScale. So autonomous vehicles need to see their environment. They need to perceive their environment so that they can drive through it without crashing into stuff, basically. And they use typically three types of sensors to do that. They use LiDAR, those Velodyne things that spin on the roof of the Google cars looking like a KFC chicken bucket or something. They use cameras like from Mobileye, and they use radar. But each of these different types of sensors has their own respective strengths and weaknesses. LiDAR, really high precision, but very expensive, and works poorly in inclement weather. Radar doesn't care about weather, but it's fairly low resolution. Can't tell a car from a truck or a refrigerator, right? Cameras, they see great. They can see colors like we can, but they can also get blinded like our eyes can, right? So poor weather or excessive sun or lack of light, right? So what if you could go and fuse all of those different sensor types together into one complete representation of the environment? You could get basically better perception to allow vehicles to more consistently see. Kind of like what we do as humans. We have stereoscopic cameras built into our heads, and we have radar or sonar here, and we have accelerometers, a proprioceptive system, right? And then we have this big neural net in our heads that fuses it all together and tells us what's around us. That's essentially what DeepScale is doing, is developing the software to help autonomous vehicles perceive their environment. The sixth company that we invested in is a company founded by two ladies up in Chico, a couple hours north of here, called Work Truck Solutions. And what they discovered was that it's apparently pretty hard to find a work truck, a medium-duty truck of the configuration that you need. So we as consumers, if we're out trying to buy a car, it's pretty easy to go into a dealership, and if they don't have what you need, to do a dealer trade and hunt down that car at another dealership. But in the work truck industry, the dealer industry, it's been a lot easier, or excuse me, a lot more difficult, because they haven't put that vehicle inventory online. So what these ladies have created is a solution to allow commercial truck dealers to both track their truck inventory and market that truck inventory online to enable dealer trade. The second to last company that we've invested in is called Spot Hero. And this is a company that basically allows you to use an app that allows you to find parking spots in parking garages in urban centers and book that online. So find, reserve, pay for parking. And then the last company that we just invested in was founded by a lady that spun out of Xerox PARC in Palo Alto that does high precision radar. So I mentioned earlier that radar has its own strengths and weaknesses. It doesn't see very well, or sees very well in poor weather, but it's not very, very precise. So what if you could have the precision of LiDAR with the weather while being impervious to weather like radar? That's essentially what they do, is high precision radar. So with that, I will wrap up. And those are some of the companies that we're excited about, and I'm interested to speak with you all a bit about transportation policy and hopefully learn from you.
Well, I wanted to take this opportunity to thank the panel members. So thank you, Randy, Arvin, and Quinn, for sharing your perspective. So I just did a quick check to see if we had any questions online, and they've left us. Maybe no questions at all, but we'll check back with them. So I'll just open it up to questions in the audience.
I'm Bernard Soriano, I'm Deputy Director at the California DMV. I don't have a question, but just, Arvin, I have an issue with one of the slides that you had saying that the California autonomous vehicles regulations are stalled. You know, those regulations are moving. We've had the testing regulations in place since 2014, and to date we've got 37 companies that are approved for testing. And we're in the middle of the formal rulemaking process for deployment of those autonomous vehicles, as well as modifying the testing regulations to allow for completely driverless testing. So we are moving forward with it. It's not stalled whatsoever, and I just want to make sure everyone is aware of that.
Thanks for clarifying that, and I think I should have put for trucks, basically, so I'm kind of coming at it from the trucking perspective. And for example, there's 3 states which really make no distinction between a light duty and a heavy duty, whereas in the state of California, we have the weight limit of 10,000. So that, I guess I should have been a little bit more specific.
So I just wanted to add, I love DMV. You guys are great. Bernard, Director Shiyamoto, great partners. But we are at a crisis point, I think, with freight movement in the United States, in that we're around 30,000 truck drivers short, and nothing against the regs, but we have a real problem in California. And so by capping it at 10,000, you leave out the heavy fleet that delivers the freight. And so that's why we're excited about testing the Volvo trucks with Uber Freight, because we have a real problem. And then as you add congestion, your drivers that are short, you can't get the goods out of the port of Long Beach and Los Angeles. And at least when I worked for Caltrans, we used to say about 1 out of every 8 jobs in Southern California are goods moving related. And so as you put these folks out of business, you're going to have a hard time getting these goods to market. And so that's part of our economic vitality in California. So you may want to look into
that. Yeah, we recognize that, and we know that that 10,000-pound limit is an issue, and we've always said that's the next thing that we're going to tackle. First, we want to do the commercial or the passenger vehicles, and then the commercial vehicles. So that's on our radar. We're going to be moving forward with that.
Look forward to that. Randy, Joshua Cunningham, I work for the California Air Resources Board. Can you talk a little bit about how other public agencies, local or state, are partnering with you? You talked a lot about your corporate partners, which are critical for your enabling the testing to occur. But how are others on the public side learning from what's happening at the proving grounds in Contra Costa?
So as part of, first of all, when we signed up to become eligible to be designated as a test bed, we agreed that we would give up data, which when we tried to pass our AB 1592 bill, we added a data amendment, and we had to pull that data amendment because of all the outreach from the tech companies, because we really don't know what the data is worth. But we agreed with USDOT that where appropriate, we would share data with other entities like other state DOTs, our state DOT, and our partners. So that's one. We're going to try to do that. We're not there yet. The other thing that we've signed agreements with is to share with other countries, because if you think about a vehicle, it has to be sold not only in the United States, but elsewhere. And so a lot of our economy is based on manufacturing in the United States, shipping the car somewhere else. So you don't want to have 2 separate plants. So we're trying to make sure we share data with other countries so that we're in line with that. But the public agencies, so on the first and last mile issue, we're not a transit agency, we're a sales tax authority. So LAVTA, Livermore, Amador Valley Transit Authority, and County Connection, our local bus provider, they're going to partner with us to make sure that they understand this technology, because they may have to either manage it, own it, or stand by it and then hook up to it, link up to it, and make that connection, protect that connection between the shared autonomous vehicle. So we're expanding our reach out to other public agencies.
So Randy, I'm delighted that you are indeed spending 25% of your time. A question for you though, in the other work you're doing, are you still wearing your freight hat? Because I think so often, and I'm delighted to have this panel, of course, talking about freight and the economy in motion, But the same conversation we had about the City of Oakland parking and mobility applies to the freight sector as well. So how do we kind of integrate those discussions? Because for example, your spot hero, it sounds more like it's a pedestrian or a passenger vehicle app for finding a park space. Well, we have a huge issue in truck parking. We have hours of service regs with no truck parking available. So we have, basically our highways have become truck parking lots because otherwise our drivers would lose their ability to earn their living. So I just want to encourage all of you to think about this cross-pollution and this integration and the codependency. And, for our truck platooning, I think one of the biggest challenges is it's clearly not the technology. The technology's there. We talked a little bit about the regs, and they allow us to move forward, but also those little cars dart in between, that gray car we saw is always going to be there, and it's always going to try to break the chain because we're an impatient society, I think. So I just want to encourage all of you, with everything else that you're doing, to really think about how we keep the goods moving, because it's all of the challenges we talk on the other panels about are replicated and need to be integrated.
So, any other questions out in the audience? So I guess I'm the first moderator that gets to ask my own questions. Part of the panel's, the conversation we wanted to keep sort of to the theme of was that we want to keep California competitive. And keeping California competitive means it has to do with economy. It has to do with not just keeping it competitive for the industries that you each represent, the investors, the transportation innovators, but rather the other industries that are either, that for the most part might be positively impacted, but also could be negatively impacted. So I wanted the perspective of the three panel members to that conversation, because I've heard throughout the theme of each of your presentations that laws need to be changed, government needs to move faster, and yet government takes into consideration all of these things as the community impacts, it's innovation, it's technology, it's safety, it's all of these things. So how do you propose getting that synergy so that we are somewhat in lockstep with technology, we being the public sector?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. First of all, it puts a lot of pressure on the procurement processes because they're not set up to deal with technology that moves at a rapid pace the way we see it. So by the time you get an RFP out, it's 6 to 10 months, and then you go out and you gather input, and then somebody files a protest, and you finally award the contract a year and a half later, and they're on version 2, and you're buying the version that they have to actually pull out of the mothballs to give you, and they're saying, why do you want to buy that? So we're struggling with the procurement process. We're also working with our local partners to make sure that they want, the partners that we have on the local side immediately say we need to stay relevant. So they want to engage to make sure they understand how all this is going to work and how it's going to affect their business, and how can they leverage the technology to enhance their services. And then Jeff Shoemaker's in the back, and he worked for Lindsay Transportation Solutions, and they build a barrier. And so when we announced Momentum Station, Jeff and Chris came in and they said, if you need a barrier, a lightweight movable barrier, we're in. Because I think these companies can see the future, and that if we need a barrier, right, Jeff? They're on the hook, and they're built in California. So part of our initiative was to try to keep jobs in California. And then with the influx of grant money in my career, I've seen where we start these technology-based projects that are pushing the marriage between the public sector, the private sector, and the tech. A lot of startup companies are started, and they flourish later on. They're big companies. And so that's what we're trying to replicate. So that's kind of our approach of how we're doing it. And plus, once you start accepting one and you do a press release, pretty soon all these little startup companies are coming to Contra Costa County saying, hey, we want to deploy in your county because we think it's easy. Versus going somewhere else and they know you're talking to the wrong person, go talk to her, go talk to him, and they go all around, they give up, or they go broke and they're gone. And so what we try to do is, if it makes sense, we're going to try to find a way to deploy it in Contra Costa County.
Just to add to that, I think the fundamental realization is partnership is key. And there is obviously a need for clear education and outreach. And one of the things the state could do is to tap into the success plenty of successes that the state has seen. So for example, the connected vehicle test bed, autonomous vehicle testing and proving grounds. One low-hanging fruit, and I say this very respectfully, is we could tap into some of these projects that are either ongoing or concluding and start thinking about how to leverage the results, the findings, and kind of move them along. And I think that's where the public and the private agencies, sectors could actually meet halfway to sort of determine the agenda, real world problems that need to be solved, and sort of come up with model deployments and try to scale it. And we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to start from ground zero. And I think that's where, you know, all of us being here and recognizing this as an important issue, but also realizing that there's plenty of good things going on in the state and how to tap into that. I think that's kind of the attitude that's really going to take us to the next step.
I can share a quick comment, and I unfortunately don't have a proposed solution, but I can at least share what I see as a problem. So a lot of venture capitalists are hesitant to fund startup companies that are reliant on the government, either as an enabler for that startup or as a customer for that startup. Right, so while in Peloton's case, government would be an enabler, right? So enabling regulations that will allow them to operate. In one of my personal portfolio companies' case, Connected Signals, they gather traffic light data from cities, and then they broadcast it to improve safety and fuel economy and whatnot. They, again, government as an enabler, they need the data from the government so they can go and then find a customer and make money on it. And so a lot of VCs are really hesitant to, and by the way, Randy sitting over here is one of those enablers who's been really helpful in providing some of that data to Connected Signals. But a lot of VCs, when they hear that this startup's business model is dependent on receiving something from the government or selling something to the government, a lot of VCs shy away. And so I don't know what's the solution, but I'd say the ask would be make it a little bit easier for startup companies to get something from you that they need or sell something to you more quickly. Big complaint being sales cycles for governments are really slow. You know, that a lot of VCs will say that. And so those companies aren't getting funded because of that perception, whether it be true or false.
This question is for Quinn. Can you talk about some of the the diligence you do with some of the startup companies that you've mentioned in your portfolio, and as you look at new technologies and opportunities that are provided to you? And then secondly, the role of government in helping to de-risk and move companies into your portfolio and away from the public portfolio for potential investment?
And by public portfolio, you mean public sector or publicly traded corporations?
Yeah, not publicly owned companies, but the government invested.
So how can government shift projects that were traditionally handled by government over to the private sector?
So the first question is on the diligence that you might be able to speak to. The second one is California has programs that invest on the supply side companies, emerging companies, if you will, in the transportation sector, and some of them are making it to the venture funding or other institutional investments, and some of them are remaining within the public portfolio, not being able to make that leap because they're not making it on either the end side, the customer side, or the market side, and it's too early for either the company or the technology to move forward.
Mm-hmm. So let me first try to address your second question. So I like to see when governments enable startups, test beds for startups. I think Gomentum's a great example of that. But there's also not only facilities like that, but pilot programs that a lot of governments are funding around. We love to see that, right? So it's basically non-dilutive funding for us as investors. What are the right test beds and what are the right pilot programs? I'm not qualified to say that. I just kind of know it when I see it. To address your first question about due diligence, what do we look for? So it's kind of like real estate. Number one is team. Number two is team. Number three is team. Right, and these are little companies, and it's the people that are going to make or break these companies. So we first look for just relevant expertise in these people, and then the second thing we look for is a market. So is there an actual market for the product or service that they're looking to commercialize? we also look for competitive differentiation. Are they doing something unique? Or are they doing the same thing that every other corporation or government or other startup is doing? There's a bunch of other factors and ways that we do it, but those are kind of the core.
Let me just say this from a public sector. I worked in the public sector for my whole life. I started at the state, now I'm at a local level. It's a different view. So government employees are not paid to take risk. There's nothing in your contracts to say, oh yeah, Randy, go take a bunch of risk, and if you fail, that we're going to protect you and you'll be okay. I know that in our case, of our 20 employees, of the 19 that work with me, if you ask them, they know that I own the calculated risk. And so what we do is we do our due diligence. And so there's a company, just to say, Commissioner Inman, that actually measures delay at train crossings using an app. So they'll relay this information out, and I said, oh my God. He came up to me, I was giving a speech in Canada. I'm half Canadian, half Japanese, half Hawaiian. And I was in Canada, and this kid came up to me and says, you know, I got this product. I said, we can use that in Richmond, California, because of all the trains running that coal through that city. And we'll help gather information to then determine what's the next grade separation project where you separate the rail, because you'll have data. And you can relay that information out to the emergency response teams to say, this is the average delay over time. And so he didn't know where to go. And so right away I said, just doing the due diligence and the risk, I said, there's no risk on the downside, so let's come to California from Canada and let's do a pilot, and then we'll do a big media blitz on this and talk about how we're gathering data to make it safer. You'll understand how to make better decisions, because a lot of times we'll make decisions not based on data but gut feel. And so we're trying to partner with these agencies. So that's another example of freight.
Got one more question back there. The mic's floating around. Eric, got one more question.
So picking up on what Randy was saying, I've only been in public service for about 5 years, and before that I was a serial entrepreneur working with startups, so I identify with Quinn, and then before that I actually worked in a commercial transportation truck dealership, and that's where I did my doctoral studies. I studied that. And so I know that our commercial transportation businesses, they're dependent on their parts and service revenue. They don't survive based on sales. So the images and numbers we saw from Tony earlier today, where you go from 2,000 parts to 18 parts, is catastrophic for the parts and service industry. But the panels that we're listening to now made me think of the idea of fleet consolidation. And maybe this is for Quinn. Right now, just looking up owner-operator advocacy groups, it says on one of these sites that 90% of the trucking industry is currently made of small business trucking companies with 10 or less trucks. Do you and the other members of the panel see these new disruptive technologies destroying that sort of small business sector, or do you see it propping them up so that they could survive and thrive going forward? Some of both. Creative destruction. I mean, one of the bets that we placed, I mentioned that company Realign earlier. They're essentially leveling the playing field for all the little guys who can't afford the big Oracle and SAP implementations to allow their organization to thrive because of IT, right? So all the tiny little guys, you can just download a set of apps and be allowed to compete a bit more with the enormous logistics brokerages, but that also applies to truckers and sole proprietors who actually own a small fleet. But yes, there's also destruction of the little guy that's going on, right? So you can say that truck drivers, there's a shortage of truck drivers, right? In most states, truck drivers are the number one occupation, but there's also a big complaint that there's a large shortage of them. So we're going to with autonomous, we can both solve this shortage, but then also subsequently put a lot of people out of a job. Which is yes a bad thing, but is it a bad thing on a net basis for society? I'm a believer that no, it's not. I think when the internet came around, all the people who were displaced from that, they found something new, and I think that a lot of the people that will be displaced by the startups that we are funding and that governments are supporting, I think they also will find something new. I think that the catastrophic scenario is if everything happens at once, right? So if there's an overnight switch to autonomous or completely, shared vehicles instead of privately owned, yes, you have a lot of people who are very quickly out of work, but in this case, I don't think that's going to happen. I think it's going to be a slow but sure transition over a decade or more, at least relating to autonomous.
Okay. All right, so with that, we've got a few minutes left, and I'm not going to keep you guys for 6 minutes just to keep the time. So I want to give a round of applause to our panel members. And thank everybody for sticking around. I know it's already lunchtime. So we're going to take a short 1-hour break. We'll see you guys back after lunch. The 1:30 panel is the panel for Transportation Technology and Services, Social Environmental Impact.